Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Maya Chen had always found museums peaceful. The Metropolitan Museum's pre-Columbian wing was nearly empty on that Tuesday afternoon, just her and the security guard dozing by the entrance. She pressed her face closer to the glass case containing the obsidian mirror, its surface black as midnight despite the overhead lights. The placard read Tezcatlipca's mirror, circa 1500 CE, origin disputed. The artifact seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, drawing her eyes deeper into its polished darkness. The eclipse had started an hour ago, casting strange shadows through the skylights. Maya pulled out her phone to check the time, 3:47 p.m, when the mirror's surface rippled like water. She stumbled backward, but her reflection didn't move with her. Instead, it reached out from within the obsidian depths, fingers breaking through the glass that suddenly felt liquid against her palm. The world tilted. Maya's stomach lurched as if she were falling through space, and then sunlight blazed against her eyelids. Real sunlight, not the muted glow of museum lighting. The air carried scents she couldn't identify. Flowers, smoke, something earthy and rich. Voices surrounded her, speaking in rapid syllables that flowed like music. Maya opened her eyes and immediately regretted it. She lay on smooth stone paving beside a canal where brightly painted canoes glided past loaded with goods she'd never seen. Vendors called out from floating gardens that seemed to exist impossibly on the water's surface. Pyramids rose in the distance, their steps climbing toward the sun like stone mountains. The city stretched in all directions, connected by waterways and bridges, more magnificent than anything she'd ever imagined. A woman's scream cut through the market noise. Maya turned to see a group of warriors in feathered costumes dragging a bound man toward the largest pyramid. Even from this distance, she could see the obsidian knives glinting at their belts, could hear the victims' pleas carried on the wind. Her stomach clenched as she realized what she was witnessing. "Teotl! Teotl!" the shout came from behind her. Maya spun around to find a crowd gathering, pointing at her jeans and NYU sweatshirt with expressions of terror and awe. Some threw themselves prostrate on the stones, while others backed away, making signs she didn't recognize. An elderly woman pushed through the crowd, her huipil embroidered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the sunlight. She spoke rapidly in Nahuatl, gesturing at Maya's clothing, her pale skin, her sneakers. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shaking their heads violently. Before Maya could process what was happening, armoured warriors pushed through the throng. Their cotton armour was painted in brilliant colours, and their shields bore the image of a hummingbird wreathed in flames. They surrounded her with obsidian-tipped spears, shouting commands she couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. The temple district was even more overwhelming up close. Maya stumbled along between her captors, trying to process the impossible architecture around her. Priests in blood-stained robes climbed the pyramid steps in procession, carrying smoking censers that filled the air with copal incense. The sound of drums echoed off the stone walls, punctuated by conch shell horns that made her bones vibrate. They dragged her into a chamber decorated with skulls and feathered serpents. 3 priests waited inside, their hair matted with dried blood, their earlobes stretched by jade plugs that caught the torchlight. The eldest stepped forward, studying Maya with eyes like chips of obsidian. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Tlain titewatl, teotl achnozo tlakate kolotl?" Maya shook her head, spreading her hands in the universal gesture of incomprehension. One of the younger priests hissed something that made the others step back. The eldest raised his hand for silence, then approached Maya slowly, as if she might burst into flames. He reached out and touched her sweatshirt, rubbing the cotton between his fingers. His eyes widened. He spoke again, more gently this time, but Maya could only shake her head helplessly. The priest conferred in rapid whispers, occasionally glancing at her with expressions that shifted between reverence and suspicion. The eldest priest finally nodded to the guards, who relaxed their grip but didn't release her. He spoke a single word that sounded like a command, and Maya found herself being led from the chamber, not roughly but with careful purpose. The noble's compound sat on a rise overlooking the main canal, its walls painted with murals depicting warriors and gods in eternal battle. Maya was escorted through courtyards filled with exotic flowers and caged quetzal birds, their green gold feathers shimmering like jewels. Servants in simple white cotton tunics prostrated themselves as they passed. The woman who greeted them in the main hall was perhaps 40, with greying hair braided with jade beads and a bearing that spoke of absolute authority. She wore a huipil so finely woven it might have been made of silk, decorated with patterns Maya was beginning to recognise as deliberately symbolic. When the priest finished his explanation, the woman studied Maya with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Ithaca Sitlali," she said, pointing to herself. Then she pointed at Maya and raised her eyebrows questioningly. "Maya," she replied, touching her chest. "Maya Chen." Sitlali repeated the name slowly, frowning at the unfamiliar sounds. She clapped her hands, and a young man appeared from the shadows. He was perhaps Maya's age, with the athletic build of a warrior, but clothing that marked him as nobility. Geometric tattoos decorated his arms, and his hair was bound up with feathers and small bones. Sitlali spoke to him rapidly, gesturing at Maya. The young man's eyes widened, and he looked at Maya with undisguised curiosity. Unlike the others, he didn't seem afraid of her, just fascinated. "Ithaca Nakali," he said, touching his chest. Then he pointed at Maya and attempted her name. "Yeah?" She nodded, and his face broke into a grin that was surprisingly warm. He said something to his mother, for clearly that's what Sitlali was, who nodded and spoke a few sharp commands to the servants. Over the next several days, Maya learned that she'd landed in the middle of a theological crisis. Nakali, who'd been taught some Spanish by captured traders, was able to communicate in broken fragments that the priests were divided about her nature. Some believed she was Quetzalcoatl returned, as prophesied. Others insisted she was a demon sent to test their faith. Still others claimed she was simply a foreign spy, though from what impossibly distant land they couldn't say. Sitlali had taken her in partly from curiosity and partly from calculation. As a widow of noble blood, she maintained her position through careful political manoeuvring. Harbouring a potential deity, or demon, was a dangerous gamble that could elevate her family or destroy it entirely. Maya spent her mornings learning basic Nahuatl from Nakali, who proved to be a patient if unconventional teacher. He would point at objects around the compound, repeating their names until she could pronounce them correctly. In return, she taught him English words, though she was careful not to reveal too much about where or when she came from. "Your land," he asked one afternoon as they sat in the garden, "is it beyond the great water?" Maya considered her answer carefully. "Very far," she said in halting Nahuatl. "Many suns' journey." Nakali nodded gravely. "The priests say strangers come from the sunrise land, men with pale skin like yours, riding giant deer." Maya's blood chilled. She knew what he was describing and when. The Spanish had landed in 1519, and if she was right about the date, Cortés was probably already marching inland with his conquistadors and Tlaxcalan allies. "When?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "The runners brought word 3 days past. The Totonaks send gifts to these strangers, thinking them gods." Nakali's expression darkened. "But Huitlatawani Moctezuma is troubled. The priests say the 5th sun grows old, that the end approaches." Maya's mind raced. She was witnessing history at its most crucial turning point, but any knowledge she shared could brand her as a prophet or a blasphemer. Either role was likely to end with her heart cut out on a temple altar. The compound's routines became familiar over the following weeks. She learned to navigate the complex hierarchies of servants and nobles, to recognise the different classes of priests by their dress and scarification. The sight of daily sacrifices at the neighbourhood temples never stopped making her sick, but she learned to hide her revulsion behind a mask of respectful incomprehension. Sitlali treated her as an honoured guest whose true nature remained mysterious. She was given fine clothes in the Aztec style, a huipil embroidered with hummingbirds and flowering vines, a skirt that swept the ground as she walked. Servants brought her meals of unfamiliar but delicious foods, chocolate thick with honey and spices, tamales stuffed with turkey and chilies, fruits that tasted like nothing she'd ever experienced. But underneath the comfort lay constant tension. Guards watched her at all times, and she caught servants making protective signs when they thought she wasn't looking. Messages arrived frequently from the palace, and each one left Citlali looking more worried. The summons came on a morning when storm clouds gathered over the valley, turning the sky the colour of old jade. Necali burst into Maya's chamber, his face pale beneath his tattoos. "Mother says you must come quickly," he said in Spanish. "The Huey Tlatoani commands your presence." The imperial palace occupied an entire district of the city, its walls higher than cathedral spires and decorated with murals that told the history of the Aztec people. Maya was escorted through courtyards filled with exotic animals. Jaguars pacing in gilded cages, quetzal birds whose feathers were worth more than gold, tanks containing creatures she couldn't identify. The throne room was a symphony of precious materials. Moctezuma II sat on a throne carved from a single block of jade, wearing a headdress of quetzal feathers that seemed to capture and reflect light like green fire. His huipil was woven with threads of actual gold, and jade plugs stretched his earlobes to inhuman proportions. He was younger than Maya had expected, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes that held depths of calculation she couldn't fathom. The Emperor studied her for long minutes without speaking, while courtiers and priests arranged themselves around the chamber according to strict protocols. Maya kept her eyes downcast as Necali had instructed, but she could feel Moctezuma's gaze like a weight on her shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, almost musical. An interpreter translated his words into Spanish for her benefit. "The Huey Tlatoni says you're not of this world. The priests have cast divinations. Some say you herald the return of Quetzalcoatl. Others claim you are a demon sent by Tezcatlipoca to test our faith. Still others believe you are simply a mortal from distant lands, though from where they cannot say." Maya remained silent, knowing that anything she said could be twisted to support any interpretation. He asks, "Which god sent you to Tenochtitlan?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Maya could feel dozens of eyes upon her, could sense the barely contained violence that surrounded the throne. One wrong word would see her dragged to the altar. "Great Lord," she said carefully, "I am only a traveller who has lost her way." The interpreter relayed her words. Moctezuma's expression didn't change, but several priests exchanged meaningful glances. The Emperor spoke again. "He says the gods do not send travellers by accident. You arrive when strange omens multiply, when pale-skinned strangers land upon our shores. The priests say the fifth sun ends, that our world faces transformation or destruction." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of everything she knew about this moment in history, all the tragedy that was about to unfold. But sharing that knowledge would only convince them she was either divine or demonic. "I know nothing of such things, great lord. I seek only to return to my own people." This time when the interpreter spoke, Moctezuma leaned forward slightly. His next words chilled Maya's blood. He says, "If you are divine, you will be honoured above all others. If you are mortal, you will be sacrificed to ensure the gods' favour in the trials ahead. The priests will determine which you are through sacred tests." The tests began the next day. Maya was moved to a chamber within the temple complex, its walls decorated with images of flayed gods and flowering hearts. Priests came at all hours to study her, measuring her bones, examining her teeth, testing her blood against various substances whose purposes she didn't want to contemplate. They brought her foods that were clearly tests, some probably poisoned, others blessed or cursed in ways she couldn't understand. She ate sparingly and drank only water, claiming fasting was required by her distant gods. The priests noted everything, consulting their codices and casting lots with jade beads. Necali was allowed to visit once each day, ostensibly to serve as interpreter, but really to gather intelligence for his mother. Through him, Maya learned that the situation in the city was deteriorating rapidly. More reports arrived daily of the Spanish advance. Montezuma had ordered gifts sent to the strangers, hoping to appease them if they were indeed gods, but the priests were split on how to respond. "Some say we should attack immediately," Necali whispered during one visit. "Others counsel waiting to see if the strangers prove themselves divine. The Huey Tlatoni grows more troubled each day." Maya wanted desperately to warn him, to somehow change the course of history she knew was coming. But any specific knowledge would only damn her. She was trapped between silence and prophecy, both equally dangerous. The crisis came during the festival of Toxcatl. Maya was brought from her chamber to witness the ceremonies, ostensibly because her reactions would help determine her nature. She was placed on a platform overlooking the main plaza, surrounded by guards and priests who watched her every expression. The plaza filled with thousands of citizens dressed in their finest clothing, their feathers and jade jewellery creating a sea of brilliant colour. Dancers moved in intricate patterns while drums thundered and conch shells wailed. The air grew thick with copal smoke and the fervour of religious ecstasy. Then the sacrifices began. Maya had witnessed individual killings at neighbourhood temples, but this was slaughter on an industrial scale. Prisoners were dragged up the pyramid steps in endless procession, their hearts cut out and offered to the gods while their bodies were flung down the blood-slicked steps. The crowd cheered with each death, their faces upturned to catch drops of sacred blood. She tried to maintain her composure, but the sheer scale of it overwhelmed her. When a child no older than 10 was dragged past her platform, his terrified eyes meeting hers for just a moment, Maya doubled over and vomited onto the stones. The reaction was immediate. Some priests cried out in triumph, claiming her revulsion proved she was mortal and offended by proper worship. Others argued that her reaction showed divine displeasure with the quality of the offerings. Nakali tried to explain that she came from a land where such practices were unknown, but his words only fueled the debate. That night, Maya lay in her chamber listening to the celebrations continue in the plaza below. The smell of blood and smoke seemed to have soaked into the very walls. She knew she was living through the final days of a civilization, watching a world that would soon be swept away by smallpox and Spanish steel. The decision came 3 days later. Maya was awakened before dawn by the sound of marching feet. Guards surrounded her bed, their faces grim in the torchlight. The head priest stood in the doorway, his obsidian knife already in his hand. "The gods have spoken," he announced in Spanish. "You will be offered to Huitzilopochtli at the sunrise ceremony. Your divine or mortal nature will be revealed by your death." They dragged her through the pre-dawn darkness toward the great temple. The pyramid loomed against the stars like a mountain of shadow, its steps worn smooth by the blood of thousands. Maya's mind raced, searching for escape routes, for words that might save her, for anything that could prevent what was about to happen. The crowd had already gathered in the plaza, their faces painted with sacred designs, their bodies swaying to drum rhythms that seemed to echo the beating of her terrified heart. Torches blazed from every surface, turning the scene into something from a fever dream. As they climbed the pyramid steps, Maya felt each stone through her thin sandals, felt the sticky residue of old sacrifices beneath her feet. The obsidian mirror she'd seen in the museum, could it possibly be hidden somewhere in this temple? Had it somehow travelled through time just as she had? At the pyramid summit, the altar waited like a mouth open to swallow her. 4 priests seized her limbs, while the 5th raised his knife toward the stars. Below, the crowd had fallen silent, waiting for the moment when divine or mortal nature would be revealed. The obsidian blade caught the first ray of sunrise as it appeared over the eastern mountains. Maya closed her eyes and thought of her own world, of museums and electric lights, and a time when human sacrifice was just something you read about in history books. The blade descended, and the world ended. Not her world, but the world itself. The sun vanished as if snuffed out by a giant hand, plunging the plaza into absolute darkness. The crowd's silence shattered into screams of terror. Wind howled across the pyramid top, carrying with it the scent of ozone and approaching storm. In the chaos, Maya felt her bonds loosen as the priest stumbled away in panic. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the terror on thousands of upturned faces. Thunder crashed like the footsteps of gods, and rain began to fall in sheets that washed the blood from the altar stones. Maya rolled off the altar, her hands searching desperately through her clothing. There, sewn into the lining of her sweatshirt where she'd hidden it weeks ago, a fragment of obsidian mirror, broken off when she'd first fallen through time. Her fingers closed around it just as another lightning bolt struck the temple. The mirror fragment grew warm in her palm, then hot, then burning. Reality rippled around her like water disturbed by a stone. The screaming crowd faded, the pyramid dissolved, the storm became distant thunder. She was falling again, tumbling through space and time while obsidian darkness swallowed everything. Maya awoke on the museum floor, her body aching as if she'd been climbing pyramids all night. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the pre-Columbian wing. Through the skylights she could see the eclipse ending, the sun emerging from behind the moon like hope returning to the world. The security guard was shaking her gently, asking if she was okay, if she needed medical attention. Maya sat up slowly, her head spinning. The obsidian mirror in its display case looked exactly as it had before, dark and mysterious and utterly normal. But the smell of copal incense lingered in her nostrils. The rhythm of sacred drums echoed in her ears, and when she looked at her hands she could swear she saw traces of blood beneath her fingernails, though the guard assured her she hadn't been injured in her fall. Over the following days, Maya tried to return to normal life. She attended classes, worked on assignments, told everyone she'd simply fainted during the eclipse. But the dreams wouldn't stop. Every night she found herself back in Tenochtitlan, walking through markets that would soon be ruins, watching faces that would soon be erased by disease and conquest. She researched everything she could find about the final days of the Aztec Empire, searching for some trace of her presence there. In obscure Spanish chronicles she found mentions of a pale woman who appeared in Moctezuma's court shortly before the conquest, described variously as a goddess, a demon, or a spy from unknown lands. Some accounts claimed she vanished during an eclipse, taken by the gods to spare her from the coming destruction. But it was in a modern archaeological report that Maya found what she was really looking for. Excavations beneath Mexico City had uncovered a fragment of unusual obsidian, carved with patterns that didn't match any known Aztec techniques. The report noted that similar fragments had been found at sites across Mesoamerica, always in contexts dating to just before the Spanish conquest, as if someone had been deliberately scattering pieces of the same artifact across time and space. Maya stared at the photographs in the report, her heart racing. She knew those patterns, had felt them beneath her fingers as reality dissolved around her. Somewhere in the depths of the ancient city, her broken mirror had become part of the archaeological record, a tiny piece of evidence that someone from another time had walked those streets and breathed that air. The museum's pre-Columbian wing felt different now when she visited. The artifacts weren't just relics of a dead civilization. They were pieces of lives she'd witnessed, fragments of a world she'd briefly inhabited. The obsidian mirror in its case seemed to watch her with patient darkness, holding secrets that spanned centuries. Maya never tried to touch it again. She'd learned that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. The Last Sun's court lived on in her dreams, in the phantom taste of chocolate spiced with chilies, in the echo of drums that had fallen silent 500 years ago. But sometimes, when the light was just right and shadows fell across the display case at the perfect angle, Maya could swear she saw movement in the mirror's depths. Not her reflection, but other faces, Nakali with his warrior's tattoos, Sitlali arranging her jade jewellery, Moctezuma on his throne of green stone. They were waiting there in the darkness between worlds, preserved in obsidian like insects in amber, eternal witnesses to the moment when one age ended and another began. And Maya knew that somewhere in that preserved instant, in the space between the falling knife and the lightning strike, their story continued. The fifth sun had ended, as all suns must. But in the mirror's depths, in the place where time folded back on itself like light caught in volcanic glass, the court of the last emperor endured, forever poised between prophecy and destruction, between the world that was and the world that was to come. Maya walked away from the display case, her footsteps echoing in the empty gallery. Behind her, the obsidian mirror reflected nothing but shadows and the fading light of afternoon. But in its depths, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking for them, tiny figures moved through eternal ceremonies in a city of canals and pyramids, trapped forever in the amber of time. 3 months later, Maya stood in the office of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the museum's chief curator of pre-Columbian art. The older woman's desk was covered with photographs, archaeological reports, and fragments of obsidian arranged in careful patterns. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her work, her dark eyes bright with excitement and something that might have been concern. "I have to ask," she said, setting down her magnifying glass, "because the timing is too perfect to be coincidence. You were here the day of the eclipse, weren't you? The security footage shows you near the Tezcatlipoca mirror just before the power went out. Maya's mouth went dry. I was just looking at the exhibits. I've always been interested in Aztec culture. Dr. Vasquez nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. The thing is, Maya, we've had some unusual developments since that day. Archaeological sites across Mexico have been reporting discoveries that don't fit our understanding of pre-Columbian artifact distribution. She spread the photographs across her desk. Maya recognised them from her earlier research, but seeing them in person made her heart race. Fragments of obsidian, each carved with intricate patterns that seem to shift and flow when viewed directly. These pieces are appearing in excavations from Tenochtitlan to Chichen Itza, Dr. Vasquez continued, all in contexts that date to exactly 1519. But here's what's strange. The obsidian doesn't match any known sources from that period. The crystalline structure is unusual, almost as if it existed outside normal geological processes. Maya forced her voice to remain steady. What do you think it means? That's what I was hoping you might help me understand. Dr. Vasquez picked up one of the photographs, studying it intently. You see, I've been researching the mirror in our collection. Its provenance has always been mysterious. It appeared in a private collection in the 1920s with no clear documentation of its origin. But recently, I've begun to suspect it might be more than just a ritual object. She pulled out a thick folder filled with historical documents, some so old the ink had faded to brown scratches on yellowed paper. Spanish chronicles from the conquest period mention a woman who appeared in Moctezuma's court shortly before Cortés arrived. She was described as having pale skin and speaking in an unknown tongue. Some accounts claim she could predict eclipses, others that she vanished during one. Maya's hands trembled as she recognised passages she'd read during her own research, but Dr. Vasquez was turning pages to documents Maya had never seen before. Private letters, journal entries, marginalia in Spanish religious texts. The interesting thing, Dr. Vasquez continued, is that several independent sources describe her as carrying a fragment of black stone that seemed to capture light like a mirror. One Franciscan monk wrote that she claimed it was a piece of the mirror that shows all times at once. The room felt suddenly cold despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Maya realised Dr. Vasquez was studying her reaction carefully, looking for signs of recognition or guilt. Dr. Vasquez, Maya said slowly, what exactly are you asking me? The curator leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her. I'm asking if you believe in the possibility that some objects might exist outside our normal understanding of time and space, that perhaps certain artifacts might serve as bridges between different moments in history. Before Maya could answer, Dr. Vasquez opened another folder and pulled out a photograph that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. It was a section of a stone wall covered in Aztec pictographs, clearly ancient but remarkably well preserved. Among the traditional symbols, feathered serpents, warrior eagles, flowering hearts, was an image that didn't belong. A figure in strange clothing that looked suspiciously like modern dress, standing before a great temple while the sun was obscured by darkness. The figure held something in their hands that reflected light like a mirror, and beneath their feet lay the shattered remains of what might once have been a larger mirror. This was found 3 weeks ago in excavations beneath the cathedral in Mexico City, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. It's been carbon dated to approximately 1520. The pictographs tell a story of a stranger who appeared during the reign of the last emperor, who vanished during an eclipse that the priests claimed was sent by the gods to hide her from the coming destruction. Maya stared at the photograph, seeing herself rendered in stone by hands that had been dust for 500 years. The artist had captured details no one should have known, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the distinctive pattern of her sneakers, even the expression of terror and wonder that must have been on her face during those final moments on the... I think, Dr. Vasquez said carefully, that you might be the key to understanding what really happened during those last days of Tenochtitlan, and I think you might know more about that mirror than you're letting on. Maya looked up from the photograph to meet the curator's eyes. In them she saw not accusation but hope. The hope of a scholar who had spent her life studying a vanished world and might finally have found a way to touch it directly. If I told you, Maya said slowly, that sometimes the past isn't as finished as we think it is, would you believe me? Dr. Vasquez smiled, and for a moment she looked years younger. My grandmother was from Oaxaca. She used to tell stories about objects that could carry you between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. I stopped believing in such things when I became an academic, but lately... She gestured at the photographs spread across her desk. Lately, I've been remembering that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our methodologies. Over the following weeks, Maya found herself returning to the museum almost daily. Dr. Vasquez had given her access to the research archives, and together they pieced together a picture of the final days of the Aztec Empire that no history book had ever captured. They found records of omens and portents, of strange dreams that visited the priests, of a growing sense that the world itself was coming to an end. But more than that, they found evidence that the past was more fluid than anyone had imagined. Archaeological reports documented anomalies across Mesoamerica, objects that appeared in the wrong time periods, buildings with architectural features that shouldn't have existed, artifacts that seemed to age backward rather than forward. It's as if, Dr. Vasquez explained one afternoon as they examined another cache of impossible obsidian fragments, your presence there created ripples that are still spreading through time. The mirror didn't just transport you to the past, it may have created a kind of temporal instability that allows past and present to bleed into each other. Maya thought about her dreams, which had grown more vivid over the months. Sometimes she would wake up speaking Nahuatl, her mouth filled with the taste of chocolate and chilies. Other nights she would dream of Necali, older now, leading Spanish-equipped warriors against conquistadors who seemed confused by their enemies' knowledge of European tactics. What do you think happened to them? Maya asked. To Necali and Citlali and the others? Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, studying a photograph of a recently discovered mural that showed the fall of Tenochtitlan, but with details that didn't match any Spanish account. In this version, the siege was longer, the resistance more organised, as if the defenders had possessed knowledge they shouldn't have had. I think, she said finally, that your time with them changed things in ways we're only beginning to understand. The conquest still happened, but perhaps not exactly as history recorded it. Perhaps some of them survived who shouldn't have. Perhaps some knowledge was preserved that should have been lost. That night Maya stood once again before the obsidian mirror in its display case. The museum was closed, but Dr. Vasquez had given her after-hours access, understanding that some conversations could only happen in darkness. "Are you still there?" she whispered to her reflection. "Can you hear me?" For a moment the surface of the mirror rippled like water. Maya pressed her palm against the glass and felt warmth spreading from the contact point. In the depths of the obsidian, shadows moved. Not her reflection, but other figures. Familiar figures. Necali stood in what looked like a garden, but the plants around him were wrong. Old-world flowers that shouldn't have existed in his time, growing alongside maize and amaranth. He was older, scarred by battles, but alive. When he looked up, his eyes met hers across 5 centuries, and he smiled. Behind him, Maya glimpsed Citlali arranging objects on what might have been an altar, but these weren't Aztec ceremonial items. They were a mixture of cultures, Spanish silver crosses nestled among jade figurines, Christian saints painted with the features of Aztec gods. The vision lasted only seconds before fading back to ordinary reflection, but Maya understood. The world she had known in 1519 hadn't simply ended. It had transformed, adapted, found ways to survive in the spaces between history and legend. Her presence there had created possibilities that shouldn't have existed, had given the people she'd known just enough for knowledge to navigate the catastrophe that was coming. The Last Sun's Court held its session still, but now it met in the margins of the world that had replaced it, in the hidden places where the past and present touched. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and shadows pooled like obsidian in the corners of museum galleries, those who knew how to look might catch a glimpse of feathered serpents flying through fluorescent-lit corridors, carrying messages between the world that was and the world that might have been. The Last Sun's Court held its session still, waiting for the next eclipse to set them free. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. You're 17 years old and your name is Morgan. You've always been drawn to old things. Antique shops, historical documentaries, the musty corners of libraries where forgotten books gather dust. Today, that fascination leads you down a narrow alley behind the demolition site of the old Whitmore building, where construction workers unearthed something that shouldn't exist. A medieval manuscript bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow as bone. The moment your fingers trace the strange symbols on its cover, the world tilts sideways, reality cracks like broken glass, and you tumble through darkness into a nightmare that history tried to forget. You wake face down in something wet and foul-smelling. The ground beneath you isn't concrete but cobblestone slick with substances you don't want to identify. Your modern clothes are now stained with mud and worse. The air hits you like a physical blow, thick, putrid, carrying the stench of human waste, rotting meat, and something sweet and cloying that makes your stomach lurch. Church bells are ringing with desperate urgency, an endless tolling that seems to shake the very stones beneath your feet. Rising unsteadily, you find yourself in what might charitably be called a street, though it's more like an open sewer running between buildings that lean against each other like drunken giants. The structures are wooden, their upper stories jutting out over the narrow passage, blocking most of the grey sky above. Windows are shuttered tight, but through the cracks you glimpse candlelight and hear whispered prayers in languages that sound almost familiar but not quite right. A cart rounds the corner ahead, its wooden wheels grinding against the stones. The man pushing it wears robes of coarse brown cloth, his head covered by a hood that casts his face in shadow. But it's not the man that makes your blood freeze, it's what he's carrying. Bodies. Human bodies stacked like cordwood, arms and legs dangling over the sides, some still wearing scraps of clothing, others naked and mottled with dark patches. The smell rolling off the cart makes you double over, retching onto the cobblestones. The cart pusher notices you then, his hooded head turning in your direction. He mutters something in that strange, almost English, asking what you're doing here, why you're dressed so strangely, whether you've come from the eastern districts where the pestilence is worst. His voice carries an edge of fear that cuts through your confusion like a knife. You try to answer, to explain that you don't belong here, but your words come out wrong. Your accent is alien to these streets, your vocabulary peppered with terms that won't be invented for centuries. The man takes a step backward, his hand moving to a knife at his belt. He's shouting now, calling out in that archaic tongue, and doors begin to creak open despite the obvious terror of whatever plague is ravaging this place. Faces appear in windows and doorways, gaunt and hollow-eyed, marked by desperation. They see your strange clothes, hear your foreign words, and you watch understanding bloom in their expressions, the dangerous kind that needs someone to blame for the horror consuming their world. Fingers point in your direction, voices rise in accusation, and you realise they think you're responsible somehow, that your very presence has brought this catastrophe upon them. You run through streets that twist like fever dreams, past houses marked with red X's painted in what looks like blood, past entire districts abandoned to rats and corpses. Behind you, voices rise in pursuit, spreading word of the strange foreign devil who walks among them in the time of pestilence. This isn't a reenactment. This isn't a dream. Somehow, impossibly, you've been thrown back to medieval Europe in the grip of the Black Death, the plague that killed a third of the continent's population. The manuscript was more than just an artifact. It was a doorway, a crack in time itself, and you've fallen through it into history's darkest streets. Finding shelter becomes your first priority. You discover an abandoned house where the previous occupants are long gone. Whether they fled or died becomes clear when you find the remains in the back room. A family of 4, huddled together in what might have been a final embrace. The sight should horrify you more than it does, but you're already learning to see death as just another feature of the landscape. You make camp in the front room and try to take stock of your situation. Your modern knowledge feels simultaneously precious and useless here. You know about bacteria and viruses, understand the basics of sanitation and disease transmission, but what good does that do when you're surrounded by people who believe illness is caused by bad air, divine punishment, or the malicious influence of foreigners? Your very attempts to help might be seen as witchcraft. The first few days blur together in a haze of hunger, fear, and desperate adaptation. You learn to scavenge food from abandoned houses, find water in wells that haven't been contaminated by corpses, and most importantly, hide when the living pass by, because the living in this time and place are often more dangerous than the dead. It's during one of these hiding sessions that you witness a procession of flagellants, religious extremists walking naked through the streets while whipping themselves with knotted cords, their backs raw and bleeding, their voices raised in anguished prayer. But it's not the religious procession that captures your attention. It's the family watching from a nearby doorway. A mother, father, and young daughter, all bearing the telltale signs of the plague. Dark swellings under their arms and necks, fever-bright eyes, the way they lean against each other for support. That night you hear screaming from their house. By morning, silence. Your isolation begins to weigh on you as weeks pass. You begin to take risks, venturing out during daylight, trying to observe the survivors from a distance. It's during one of these reconnaissance missions that you encounter someone who changes everything. Her name is Beatrice, perhaps 20 years old, with practical intelligence that comes from making do with scraps. She was an apothecary's apprentice before the plague took her master along with most of his knowledge. She finds you trying to treat a wound on your leg, cleaning it with boiled water and wrapping it in clean cloth. Your methods mark you as either remarkably wise or suspiciously knowledgeable. You know the ways of healing, she observes. But your methods are strange. From what land do you come? You struggle with how to answer, settling on a version that might be believable, that you're from a distant country with different ways of understanding sickness and health. Beatrice accepts this with pragmatic resignation. What matters to her is not where your knowledge comes from, but whether it can save lives. She becomes your guide to this nightmarish world, teaching you which wells are safe, which districts to avoid, how to blend in without immediately marking yourself as an outsider. Under her tutelage, you begin venturing into populated areas, always careful, always ready to run, but no longer completely isolated from human society. What you find there is both better and worse than expected. Yes, there is death everywhere, but there is also life, stubborn and determined. You see incredible kindness. A baker giving away his last loaves to hungry children, nuns caring for plague victims despite knowing their service will likely mean death. You also see cruelty that defies comprehension. Mobs dragging suspected plague spreaders through streets, families abandoning sick relatives, entire communities turning on their Jewish neighbours in fits of misdirected rage. The duality of human nature, displayed in its rawest form, becomes a constant presence. The same people who might share their last bread could, hours later, join a mob calling for a stranger's execution. Fear, you begin to understand, is more contagious than any disease. This understanding drives you to your first real attempt at intervention. Despite Beatrice's warnings, you can't stand by and watch as the merchant family succumbs to plague when you think you know how to save them. Your plan is simple: isolate the infected, maintain strict hygiene, ensure proper nutrition and hydration. For a while, it seems to work. Henry's fever breaks, the swellings recede, his family weeps with gratitude. But the plague is patient. Just when you're beginning to believe modern knowledge might triumph over medieval disease, it strikes back with redoubled fury. Within days, Henri's entire family is dead. You find their bodies arranged in their bed together, their faces peaceful despite the horror of their final hours. The failure hits you harder than anything since arriving. These people trusted you, believed in you, died believing you were trying to save them. Your past catches up with you in the worst possible way. Someone has been watching your activities, noting your strange methods. You're in the market square when accusations begin to fly. Plague-bringer, foreign devil, witch. The crowd turns toward you with focused intensity, hands reaching for stones, for clubs, for anything that can be used as a weapon. You run, but this time the pursuit is organised. They corner you in front of the cathedral where a priest emerges, his white robes pristine despite the filth around him. He raises his hands for silence, then builds the theological case for your execution with practiced ease. Foreign influences, he explains, are how Satan introduces pestilence into God-fearing communities. Your strange healing practices are clearly diabolic, designed to give false hope before delivering victims to evil. Through the pain and terror of being bound, you catch sight of Beatrice in the crowd. Your eyes meet, and you see betrayal, not the hot anger of deliberate treachery, but the cold calculation of survival. She's been questioned, pressured, threatened, and chosen the rational path. The priest raises a burning brand above his head, and the crowd falls silent in anticipation. He opens his mouth to give the final blessing, and that's when the first person in the crowd begins to cough, the wet, rattling sound of final stage plague infection. Blood spatters from the man's mouth, and panic explodes through the crowd like a lit fuse reaching powder. People scatter in all directions, the carefully orchestrated execution dissolving into chaos. You manage to work your hands free from loosened ropes and escape in the confusion. Halfway across the square, Beatrice grabs your shoulder. "Forgive me," she whispers. "The relic, the thing that brought you here. I know where it is. The priests have it in the cathedral crypt. They think it's cursed, but if it brought you to this time, getting into the cathedral proves easier than expected. Everyone else is trying to get out." The manuscript waits in a chamber below, displayed on a stone pedestal, but it's not the same book you remember. This version is older, more corrupted, its pages covered with text in multiple languages layered over each other like palimpsests. As you approach, the temperature drops noticeably, and whispers seem to echo from the pages themselves. From above, voices echo down. Your pursuers have found the cathedral entrance. There's no time for hesitation. Your hand closes on the manuscript's cover, and the world explodes into sensation. This time, the journey tears at you like a physical force, ripping you away from the medieval crypt with violence that feels like it's pulling your atoms apart. Colours that have no names bleed across your vision. You're falling through time itself, tumbling through centuries of human history, catching glimpses of wars and plagues and famines. The manuscript burns in your hands like a piece of the sun, but you don't dare let go. Then, suddenly it ends. You're lying on concrete, modern concrete, behind the Whitmore building. The air smells of exhaust and hot asphalt. Traffic sounds filter in from nearby streets. Your clothes are torn and stained, reeking of smoke and death. The manuscript lies beside you, once again just an old book giving no hint of the doorway to hell it contained. Standing leaves you dizzy and nauseous. According to your phone, only a few hours have passed since you first found the manuscript, as if your weeks in medieval Europe occurred outside normal time. The rational part of your mind constructs explanations. Heat exhaustion, chemical reactions, head injury causing elaborate hallucinations. But the physical evidence argues against these theories. Your clothes bear damage that matches your memories. Your hands show rope burns from medieval bindings. Most convincingly, you reek of wood smoke and human waste and plague-infected bodies, odours so specific your imagination couldn't have invented them. You want to throw the manuscript away, but your hands won't cooperate. Despite everything, some part of you wonders what other secrets it might contain, what other times and places might be accessible through its stained pages. Your apartment feels simultaneously familiar and alien. The refrigerator hums contentedly, full of fresh food. Clean water flows from taps. Electric lights banish darkness. These miracles of modern civilization now seem almost supernatural. You stand under a hot shower for nearly an hour, but no amount of soap can wash away the memories. Sleep brings no peace. Your dreams are filled with corpse carts and plague boils, with the faces of the merchant family as they died despite your efforts, with Beatrice's eyes in that moment of betrayal. You wake repeatedly, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced you can hear medieval voices calling your name. Days blur into weeks as trauma settles into your bones like chronic illness. You try to return to normal routine, school, friends, ordinary activities, but everything feels hollow, meaningless. Your classmates complain about homework while you struggle not to laugh at the insignificance of their concerns. Teachers assign essays about historical periods you've now experienced firsthand, and your accounts are so vivid they attract uncomfortable attention. The manuscript sits on your desk, waiting. Some days you can ignore it completely. Other days, its presence fills your apartment like poisonous gas. You research its origins but find no record of anything matching its description, as if it materialized from nowhere specifically to find you. Gradually, you understand you'll never truly escape what you experienced. The plague streets exist now inside your mind, a permanent overlay on your perception of reality. When you see homeless people, you think of medieval beggars dying alone. When news mentions disease outbreaks, you remember corpse cart wheels grinding against cobblestones. Most disturbing when you observe modern cruelties, the way people ignore suffering, blame victims, turn away from inconvenient truths. You recognise the same impulses that drove medieval mobs to hunt scapegoats. Your friends notice the change, how you've become withdrawn and distracted. They try to help with parties and movies, but their efforts only emphasise how completely you've been changed. Dr. Martinez, the therapist your parents find, has techniques for dealing with trauma, but when you try to explain your nightmares, carefully edited to remove supernatural elements, her responses feel inadequate. When news breaks of a flu outbreak in the next county, it triggers something primal in your nervous system. You find yourself checking infection rates obsessively, stockpiling supplies, having panic attacks over increased hand-washing protocols at school. The manuscript seems to pulse with malevolent energy, text appearing in margins like fresh ink, symbols shifting when you're not looking directly. You start researching other historical pandemics, Spanish flu, AIDS, recurring cholera outbreaks. The patterns are always the same: fear, scapegoating, social breakdown, the collapse of normal moral boundaries. This knowledge makes you hypersensitive to warning signs in your own community. When people make jokes about avoiding certain restaurants due to flu fears, you hear echoes of medieval mobs blaming Jewish communities. When politicians discuss closing borders, you remember plague cities sealing their gates. Your family worries when you begin serious stockpiling. Medical supplies, batteries, portable radios, equipment suggesting preparation for complete societal breakdown. Your mother finds your cache and confronts you tearfully, asking if you're planning to hurt yourself. "I'm not suicidal," you assure her. "I just want to be prepared." You don't understand what can happen when things fall apart. But how do you explain that you've seen the apocalypse, walked through it, felt its claws rake across your soul? Spring arrives, but you greet it with suspicion rather than hope. You've learned that seasons change regardless of human suffering, that flowers bloom over mass graves. Your grades slip as your ability to focus deteriorates. High school concerns, tests, college applications, social hierarchies feel like elaborate games played by people who don't understand how fragile their world really is. Manuscript remains your only constant, your secret burden and impossible proof. On quiet nights, when carrying this secret becomes unbearable, you find yourself opening it and staring at its pages, not daring to focus too intently but unable to look away. Other times beckon from those ancient pages, other disasters, other plagues, other moments when human nature revealed its true face. You're 17 years old, and you have become the keeper of secrets that could drive you insane. The knowledge of what humans really are beneath their veneer of civilization weighs on you like armor made of lead, protecting you from illusions while slowly crushing your spirit. And still, despite everything, despite the trauma and isolation and crushing weight of impossible knowledge, part of you wonders what other truths wait in those shifting pages. The manuscript waits, patient as centuries, knowing you'll return eventually, drawn by the same curiosity that brought you to it in the first place. It knows that some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied by the ordinary world. You're 17 years old, and you carry the plague streets inside you like an infection that will never heal, a reminder that reality is far more fragile and terrible than anyone who hasn't walked through hell could possibly understand. The question haunting your dreams isn't whether you'll use the manuscript again, it's whether you'll be strong enough to survive what you find when you do. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The laboratory smelled of ozone and burnt copper, a scent that had become as familiar to Elias Carter as his own breath. At 15, he moved through the maze of his parents' equipment with practiced stealth, dodging motion sensors and avoiding the blinking red lights that would betray his presence. Dr. Sarah Carter and Dr. Marcus Carter were brilliant quantum physicists, but they were also infuriatingly protective of their work, treating their son like he was still 8 years old instead of nearly 16. Tonight was different, though. Tonight Elias had spotted something new among the usual array of particle accelerators and temporal field generators, a sleek metallic glove that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. It sat alone on a workbench, connected to a complex web of cables and monitoring devices, with warning labels plastered across its surface in 3 languages. Elias had always been curious to a fault, the kind of boy who took apart alarm clocks to understand time itself, who read his parents' research papers like bedtime stories. His backpack, slung carelessly over one shoulder, was stuffed with the usual detritus of teenage life: textbooks, energy bars, and a half-dozen items he'd borrowed from the medical supply closet for a school biology project. Among them were things that would seem miraculous to someone from a different era: broad-spectrum antibiotics, antiviral compounds, even a small vial of synthetic stem cell serum his mother had been developing for regenerative therapy. The glove called to him like a siren song. Despite the warnings, despite the obvious danger, Elias found himself reaching for it with trembling fingers. The metal was warm to the touch, almost alive, and as he slipped it over his right hand, he felt a tingling sensation that seemed to reach into his very bones. The activation was accidental. A nervous twitch of his index finger against what he thought was a simple button. Instead, reality exploded around him in a cascade of light and sound that seemed to tear the fabric of existence itself. The laboratory dissolved, his parents' careful work vanishing into a whirlwind of temporal energy that lifted him, spun him, and hurled him across the centuries like a stone skipped across the surface of time. When the world solidified again, Elias found himself lying face down in mud that reeked of human waste and rotting straw. The air was thick with wood smoke and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. He pushed himself up, wiping dirt from his face, and stared in bewilderment at his surroundings. Gone were the clean white walls of the laboratory, replaced by rough wooden buildings that leaned against each other like drunken sailors. The streets, if they could be called streets, were little more than muddy channels filled with refuse. People hurried past wrapped in coarse fabric, their faces gaunt and marked by disease. Some bore the telltale buboes of plague, black swellings that marked them for death. Others coughed blood into stained rags, their bodies already surrendering to illnesses that Elias's world had conquered centuries ago. A child's cry drew his attention, a sound of pure agony that cut through the general misery like a blade. Elias followed the sound to a small hovel, where a woman knelt beside a boy no older than 7. The child's body was racked with fever, black swellings visible beneath his torn shirt, his breathing coming in shallow gasps that spoke of imminent death. "Please," the woman whispered in accented English that Elias somehow understood. "Please, someone help him." Without thinking, Elias knelt beside them. His modern medical knowledge, basic though it was, told him exactly what he was looking at. Bubonic plague, the Black Death that had killed millions in this era. In his time, it would be easily treatable, just another bacterial infection to be conquered with the right antibiotics. In his backpack, he had exactly what this child needed. The vial of broad-spectrum antibiotics was cool in his palm as he pulled it free. The woman watched with desperate eyes as he administered the medicine, her prayers mixing with his whispered explanations of dosage and treatment. The stem cell serum followed, designed to repair damaged tissue and boost immune response. The transformation was miraculous by medieval standards. Within hours, the child's fever broke. The swellings began to recede, colour returned to his pale cheeks, and by dawn he was sitting up and asking for food. The woman wept with gratitude, falling to her knees before Elias and calling him an angel, a saint, a worker of miracles. Word spread through the village like wildfire. The boy who could cure the plague, who could heal the dying with strange potions and whispered incantations. By the second day, a line of supplicants stretched from the hovel to the village square. Elias found himself caught up in a wave of adoration and desperation that both thrilled and terrified him. He told himself he was doing good as he distributed his medicines, using his knowledge to combat diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. Tuberculosis, smallpox, dysentery, all fell before his advanced treatments. He rationed his supplies carefully, but even small doses of his futuristic medicines were enough to work wonders in this primitive world. The local nobles took notice within a week. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort arrived with a retinue of knights, demanding that the miracle healer attend his ailing wife. Lady Catherine lay dying of what Elias recognised as sepsis, her body fighting a losing battle against infection. A few drops of antibiotic solution and a dose of immune boosters had her on her feet within days. Gold flowed into Elias's pockets. Servants catered to his every need. He was housed in the finest chambers, fed the richest foods, and treated with a reverence that would have been accorded to saints in this superstitious age. The power was intoxicating, the gratitude overwhelming. He began to believe his own legend, to think of himself as a saviour sent to lift humanity from the darkness of disease and death. But miracles, Elias soon learned, had consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The first signs of trouble came within a month. Families that had expected to lose half their children to disease suddenly found themselves supporting 10, 12, 15 offspring. The village granaries, planned for a population decimated by plague, groaned under the weight of unexpected mouths to feed. Fields that had been adequate for a smaller population now fell woefully short. Children who should have died in infancy grew into adults, married, and produced children of their own at an unprecedented rate. The careful balance that had kept medieval populations stable, brutal though it was, had been shattered. Where once disease had served as nature's cruel accountant, keeping numbers manageable, now there was only exponential growth. The neighbouring kingdoms watched with growing alarm as Sir Geoffrey's lands swelled with people. Rumours spread of vast armies being raised, of populations that seemed to multiply like insects. Fear bred suspicion, and suspicion bred conflict. Border skirmishes erupted as nobles worried about being overwhelmed by these unnaturally populous territories. Elias watched the chaos unfold with growing horror. Wars broke out over resources that had once been adequate, armies clashing in fields that should have been used for crops. The very medicines he had introduced with such good intentions became tools of conquest, as rulers sought to build populations large enough to overwhelm their enemies through sheer numbers. The church responded with predictable fury. Priests declared Elias a heretic, a practitioner of dark arts who violated God's will by preventing natural death. Others proclaimed him a prophet, a holy messenger sent to usher in a new age. Religious wars erupted alongside territorial conflicts, believers and skeptics slaughtering each other in the name of interpretations of Elias's work. But the worst was yet to come. After 3 months of uncontrolled healing, the medicines began to fail. Not through depletion. Elias had managed to synthesize crude versions of his treatments using local herbs and minerals. Instead, they failed because nature, in its infinite adaptability, had begun to fight back. Diseases mutated, evolving resistance to his treatments with frightening speed. Bacteria that should have been easily defeated developed new defences, while viruses learned to hide from his antiviral compounds. The results were nightmarish. People began surviving illnesses that should have killed them, but in twisted, unnatural states. Bodies that should have succumbed to plague instead endured, festering with infections that couldn't quite kill but refused to heal. Minds damaged by fever persisted in broken states, consciousness trapped in bodies that functioned just enough to maintain a mockery of life. Elias encountered his first example in the very hovel where his journey had begun. The child he had saved, young Thomas, still lived, but life had become a curse rather than a blessing. The boy's body had survived multiple exposures to disease, but each illness had left its mark. He was blind in one eye, partially deaf, his limbs twisted by infections that had been halted just short of death. His mind wandered, caught between fever dreams and waking nightmares, recognizing no one and responding to nothing. The woman who had once called Elias an angel now cursed his name, begging him to grant her son the death that had been denied him. But Elias's medicines worked only one way. They preserved life, no matter how damaged, no matter how painful. He had created a world where death was no longer an escape from suffering, but suffering without end. Cities began to collapse under their own weight. London, Paris, Rome, all buckled beneath populations they had never been designed to support. Sewage systems that had been barely adequate for medieval populations failed catastrophically. Disease, paradoxically, spread faster than ever as people packed together in desperate attempts to share dwindling resources. The unnaturally alive wandered the roads in growing numbers, people whose bodies refused to die despite injuries that should have been fatal, illnesses that should have claimed them, starvation that should have provided merciful release. They moved in shambling hordes, not quite dead but no longer truly living, spreading their mutated ailments wherever they went. Elias realized with dawning horror that he had created something far worse than the Black Death he had sought to cure. Where plague had killed quickly and moved on, his intervention had created a slow-burning apocalypse that might consume civilization itself. The natural cycles of life and death, brutal though they seemed, had served a purpose. By breaking them, he had unleashed chaos that threatened to destroy everything. Desperate to undo his work, Elias began trying to retrieve the medicines he had distributed, but it was like trying to recall smoke once it had been released. His treatments had been copied, modified, and spread across the continent. Local wise women brewed crude approximations of his antibiotics, While scholars attempted to understand the principles behind his stem cell therapies, the knowledge had taken root and was growing beyond his ability to control or contain. The time glove still functioned, its charge somehow maintained by the temporal field generators built into its core. Elias stared at it night after night, wrestling with an impossible decision. He could travel back again, prevent his younger self from ever making this trip, erase the entire nightmare timeline he had created. But that would mean condemning everyone he had saved, including young Thomas, who despite his current suffering had experienced months of healthy, happy life, to their original fates. The weight of playing God pressed down on him like a physical force. Every choice led to suffering, action or inaction, intervention or abandonment. He had learned the terrible lesson that good intentions, no matter how pure, could pave the road to hell more effectively than any evil ever could. Standing in the ruins of what had once been a prosperous village, watching the unnaturally alive shuffle through streets littered with the debris of collapsed civilization, Elias made his choice. He activated the time glove, feeling reality dissolve around him once more, and set coordinates for a few hours before his original arrival. If he could prevent his younger self from ever using the medicines, the timeline would reset, the suffering would end, and history would flow in its natural channels once more. The paradox of the encounter, meeting himself across time, sent shockwaves through his consciousness, but his older self managed to convince his younger counterpart of the truth through intimate knowledge that only Elias could possess. Together they destroyed the medical supplies before they could be used, watching the vials shatter against stone while Thomas lay dying in his mother's arms mere yards away. It was the hardest thing Elias had ever done, standing there, listening to the child's laboured breathing, knowing he could save him with a single dose of antibiotics and choosing not to act. His younger self wept openly at the cruelty of it, but his older self held firm. Sometimes, he had learned, mercy looked like letting nature take its course, no matter how brutal that course might be. The return to his own time was gentler than his departure had been, the time glove depositing him back in his parents' laboratory, with barely a whisper of displaced air. Dr. Sarah Carter and Dr. Marcus Carter were exactly where he had left them, bent over their calculations, unaware that their son had lived through centuries in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They scolded him, naturally, for tampering with dangerous equipment, confiscating the time glove and securing it behind additional layers of protection. Elias accepted their punishment meekly, saying nothing about what he had experienced, what he had learned, what he had ultimately chosen to sacrifice. In the days that followed, he researched obsessively, scouring historical records for any trace of the immortal century he had created and then erased. He found nothing. No mention of miraculous healers, no records of unprecedented population growth, no accounts of the shambling hordes of the unnaturally alive. History had reset itself, flowing in its original channels as if his intervention had never happened. But Elias remembered everything. The weight of gold in his palms, the gratitude in desperate eyes, the horror of bodies that couldn't die, the collapse of civilization under the weight of his good intentions. He remembered Thomas most of all, both the healthy child he had saved and the twisted creature that child had become, and finally the dying boy he had chosen not to heal. The time glove sat locked away in his father's laboratory, surrounded by warnings and security measures that would have challenged a master thief. Yet Elias found himself drawn to it night after night, standing before the vault that contained it, wrestling with temptations that grew stronger rather than weaker with time. He knew things now, terrible, wonderful things about the nature of history, about the delicate balance that kept civilization functioning, about the prices that had to be paid for progress. He had seen how easily the future could be destroyed by attempts to fix the past, how good intentions could lead to consequences more horrific than the problems they sought to solve. Yet the knowledge burned within him like a fever. Somewhere in the past, people were suffering from diseases he could cure, dying from conditions he could treat, enduring pain he could alleviate with a word. The power to help them sat mere feet away, locked behind barriers that his parents' own research could eventually overcome. The faces haunted him, not just Thomas, though the boy's image appeared most often in his dreams, but all the others. The woman who had lost 6 children to plague before he arrived. The noble lady whose beauty had been ravaged by smallpox. The the countless thousands who had lived brief, painful lives in an age when death was common as breathing. Elias understood now why the time glove had been built with so many safeguards, why his parents had covered it with warnings in multiple languages. They had known, perhaps from their own experiments or from theoretical calculations, how dangerous it could be to tamper with the flow of history. The temptation to fix things was irresistible, but the consequences were invariably worse than the original problems. He thought about the natural cycles he had disrupted: birth and death, sickness and health, abundance and scarcity. They seemed cruel, arbitrary, unfair when viewed from the perspective of individual suffering. A child dying of plague was a tragedy. A woman losing her beauty to disease was heartbreaking. A population decimated by illness was a catastrophe that cried out for intervention. But viewed from the broader perspective of centuries, those same cycles served essential functions. They prevented overpopulation that would lead to starvation and war. They created selective pressures that drove evolution and adaptation. They maintained balances that kept civilization stable and sustainable over long periods of time. The hardest lesson of all was accepting that sometimes the kindest thing to do was nothing. That wisdom sometimes looked like cruelty. That mercy sometimes required allowing suffering to take its natural course. It was a lesson that went against every instinct Elias possessed, every impulse to help and heal and make things better. Standing before the vault night after night, he felt the weight of that knowledge settling into his bones. He was no longer the careless boy who had stumbled into his parents' laboratory seeking adventure. He had become something else, a keeper of dangerous wisdom, a guardian of temporal integrity, a person who understood the true cost of playing God. The time glove waited in its prison of the light and steel, patient as death itself, ready to carry him back to any moment in history he chose. The past spread out before him like a vast ocean of suffering, calling to him with the voices of millions who could be saved, should be saved, deserved to be saved. All he had to do was overcome the safeguards, activate the device, and step back into yesterday with the power to change everything. But Elias had learned to resist that call, no matter how loud it became. He had seen the true face of time, not a river that could be dammed or diverted at will, but a living thing with its own terrible wisdom, its own necessary cruelties, its own delicate balance that sustained life across the centuries. Some prices he now understood were too high to pay, no matter how noble the intention. Some cures were worse than the diseases they sought to treat, and some knowledge was too dangerous to act upon, no matter how desperately it wanted to be used. The laboratory fell silent around him as he turned away from the vault, leaving the time glove to its imprisonment. In the distance, he could hear his parents working late into the night, their voices low as they discussed equations and theories that might one day unlock the secrets of time itself. They were brilliant, dedicated scientists, driven by the same desire to help humanity that had nearly destroyed it in Elias's hands. He wondered if they would face the same temptations he had confronted, the same terrible choices between action and inaction. He wondered if they would have the strength to make the right decision when the moment came, to choose wisdom over compassion, restraint over intervention. For now, though, the secrets of time remained locked away, protected by barriers both physical and moral. The past continued its ancient dance of birth and death, sickness and health, joy and sorrow, unaware of how close it had come to being saved by a boy who had learned too late that some salvation was indistinguishable from damnation. Elias Carter walked away from the laboratory that night, carrying the weight of erased centuries, the memory of choices made and unmade, the knowledge of how fragile time truly was, and how easy it would always be to destroy the future by trying to fix the past. It was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life, a secret that would define him in ways no one else could understand. But it was also, he had come to realize, a responsibility, to guard against the impulse to play God, to resist the temptation to rewrite history according to his own moral vision, to accept that sometimes the greatest act of love was learning when not to act at all. The weeks that followed were perhaps the most difficult of Elias's life. He threw himself into his studies with unprecedented intensity, but found himself unable to concentrate on anything for long. Mathematical equations blurred before his eyes, replaced by visions of Thomas's fevered face, or the shambling hordes of the unnaturally alive. His parents noticed the change in him, the way he started at sudden sounds, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare at nothing with an expression of profound sadness. Dr. Sarah Carter tried to engage her son in conversation about his future, about college applications and career aspirations. But how could Elias explain that he had already seen the future, had lived through its consequences, and knew intimately how easily it could all be undone? When she suggested he consider studying medicine, following in the family tradition of healing, he laughed bitterly, a sound that made his mother step back in concern. "Medicine is about balance," he told her one evening as they sat in the kitchen, his words carefully chosen to avoid revealing too much. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Sometimes healing one person means condemning thousands of others. Sometimes the most compassionate thing a doctor can do is nothing at all. His mother frowned, studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for complex equations. "That's a very mature perspective, Elias. Perhaps too mature for someone your age. Where did you learn to think like that?" The answer, from watching civilization collapse under the weight of my good intentions, remained locked behind his lips. Instead, he shrugged and turned back to his homework, leaving his mother to wonder what had changed her curious, optimistic son into this brooding young man who spoke of medicine like a philosopher, contemplating the nature of suffering itself. At school, Elias found himself increasingly isolated from his peers. Their concerns, grades, social media, weekend plans, seemed impossibly trivial when viewed through the lens of what he had experienced. When classmates complained about minor illnesses, he had to bite his tongue to keep from describing what real plague looked like, what it meant to watch a child die slowly from diseases that could be cured with a single pill. When they discussed historical events in class, he found himself seeing them from the perspective of someone who had lived through them, who understood the human cost of every war, every famine, every epidemic in ways that textbooks could never convey. His history teacher, Mr. Davidson, assigned a research project on the medieval period. Elias chose the Black Death, partly because he felt compelled to learn more about the era he had inadvertently devastated, and partly because he hoped that academic distance might help him process what he had experienced. The research proved to be both enlightening and torturous. Reading contemporary accounts of the plague years, Elias was struck by how closely they matched his own observations. The desperation of parents watching their children die, the breakdown of social order, the way communities either came together or fell apart under extreme pressure, all of it felt achingly familiar. But he also noticed something he had missed during his time in the past: the remarkable resilience of human beings, their ability to rebuild and recover from even the most devastating losses. The plague had indeed killed millions, but it had also led to significant social changes. Labour became more valuable when workers were scarce, leading to better conditions for peasants. The rigid feudal system began to crack under pressure, eventually giving way to more flexible social structures. Medical knowledge advanced as physicians struggled to understand and treat the disease. Art and literature flourished as people grappled with questions of mortality and meaning. Elias began to understand that history was not simply a catalogue of suffering to be alleviated, but a complex web of cause and effect, where even the most terrible events served purposes that might not be apparent for generations. The Black Death had been a catastrophe, but it had also been a catalyst for progress that might not have occurred otherwise. By preventing it, he would have eliminated not just the suffering, but also the growth that emerged from that suffering. The realization brought him no comfort. If anything, it made his burden heavier, because it meant that his choice to restore the original timeline had been correct not just practically, but morally. He had condemned millions to die, but he had also preserved their descendants' chance for a better world. The weight of that decision, and the knowledge that he might one day face similar choices, pressed down on him like a physical force. His dreams became increasingly vivid and disturbing. Night after night, he found himself back in that medieval world, but now the scenarios were different. Sometimes he dreamed of preventing the Crusades, only to watch as technological stagnation left humanity vulnerable to later threats. Other times he imagined stopping the American Civil War, only to see slavery persist for centuries longer without the catalyst of conflict to end it. Each dream followed the same pattern, good intentions leading to unintended consequences that were often worse than the original problems. The most disturbing dreams, though, were the ones where he succeeded in creating a perfect world. In these visions, he would travel back repeatedly, making small adjustments here and there, preventing wars and plagues and famines until he had crafted a timeline of uninterrupted peace and prosperity. But the people in these perfect worlds were hollow, lacking the depth and resilience that came from overcoming adversity. They were soft, complacent, unprepared for the challenges that would inevitably arise. The very act of eliminating suffering had eliminated something essential about what it meant to be human. These dreams taught him something that no amount of study could have conveyed, that pain and struggle were not simply unfortunate side effects of existence, the integral parts of the human experience. They forged character, drove innovation, created bonds between people that prosperity alone could never match. A world without suffering might seem like paradise, but it would actually be a kind of hell, a place where growth was impossible and meaning was absent. The philosophical implications of what he had learned began to reshape Elias's understanding of his parents' work. He started paying closer attention to their conversations, listening for clues about their intentions and the ethical frameworks that guided their research. What he discovered both impressed and terrified him. Dr. Sarah Carter and Dr. Marcus Carter were not simply brilliant scientists pursuing knowledge for its own sake. They were deeply thoughtful people who had spent years considering the implications of temporal manipulation. Their laboratory was filled not just with equipment, but with books on ethics, philosophy, and the history of scientific responsibility. They had clearly wrestled with the same questions that now tormented their son, and had concluded that the power to change the past was too dangerous to be used lightly. The time glove, Elias learned from overheard conversations, was not intended for historical intervention at all. It was designed as a research tool, a way to observe the past without interfering with it. The activation mechanism that had seemed so simple to his younger self was actually an emergency override, meant to be used only if an observer became trapped in the time stream and needed to return home quickly. His parents' caution, which had once seemed like paranoid overprotection, now revealed itself as hard-won wisdom. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the temptations that came with temporal power and the catastrophic consequences that could result from yielding to those temptations. The elaborate security measures surrounding their equipment were not just to keep others out, but to keep themselves from making impulsive decisions they might later regret. This knowledge brought Elias a measure of peace, but also a new concern. If his parents were so careful, so thoughtful, so aware of the dangers, what would happen when their research became public? How long before someone with less wisdom and more ambition gained access to temporal technology? How long before the temptation to fix history became too strong for humanity to resist? The answer came sooner than he expected, in the form of a news report that made his blood run cold. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former colleague of his parents who had left their research group under acrimonious circumstances, had announced a breakthrough in temporal mechanics. She claimed to have developed a method for what she called chronological healing, the targeted elimination of historical tragedies through precise interventions in the past. The scientific community's reaction was mixed, with some hailing Dr. Vasquez as a visionary and others condemning her work as dangerous pseudoscience. But Elias could see the hunger in the eyes of reporters and politicians as they discussed the implications. The promise of a world without genocide, without plague, without war was too seductive for rational thought. People wanted to believe that suffering could be eliminated simply by erasing it from history. His parents' response was swift and uncharacteristic. Dr. Sarah Carter, who usually avoided media attention, gave a series of interviews warning about the dangers of temporal manipulation. She spoke in carefully measured terms about paradoxes and unintended consequences, but Elias could hear the desperation beneath her academic language. She knew, as he did, that once the technology became available, someone would inevitably use it, regardless of the risks. The debate raged for weeks, with ethicists and scientists and politicians all weighing in on the morality of changing the past. Some argued that humanity had an obligation to prevent historical atrocities if it possessed the power to do so. Others contended that the past should remain inviolate, that the risks of intervention were too great to justify any potential benefits. Elias found himself in the unique position of knowing the answer to these debates with absolute certainty. He had lived through the consequences of temporal intervention, had seen firsthand how good intentions could lead to unimaginable horror. but he could not share this knowledge without revealing his own actions, and the weight of that secret sometimes felt crushing. The breaking point came when Dr. Vasquez announced her intention to conduct a test of her chronological healing technology. She planned to prevent a relatively small historical tragedy, a plague outbreak in a remote village in 14th century Scotland that had killed several hundred people. It seemed like a perfect test case, isolated enough that the ripple effects would be minimal, small enough that the moral calculus was clear. Who could argue against saving a few hundred innocent lives? Elias knew better. He understood that there were no small changes to history, no isolated incidents that wouldn't eventually affect the larger flow of events. Every life saved would go on to live differently, to make different choices, to have different children. Those changes would compound over the centuries, creating a butterfly effect that could ultimately reshape civilization in unpredictable ways. More terrifying still was the precedent it would set. If Dr. Vasquez succeeded in preventing one small tragedy, the pressure to attempt larger interventions would become irresistible. Why save hundreds when you could save millions? Why prevent one plague when you could eliminate disease entirely? The logic was seductive, inexorable, and utterly wrong. That night, Elias made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He broke into his parents' laboratory, using knowledge gained from years of observation to bypass their security systems. The time glove waited for him in its vault, patient and terrible in its potential, but he was not there to use it. Instead, he carefully sabotaged the device, introducing subtle flaws in its temporal field generators that would make it impossible to achieve stable time displacement. It was an act of vandalism that went against every principle he had been raised with, but also an act of responsibility that he knew his parents would understand, even if they could never approve of his methods. He was destroying humanity's best chance to travel through time, but he was also protecting the timeline from those who would misuse that power. The sabotage was discovered within days, and Elias confessed immediately when confronted by his parents. Their reaction was complex. Disappointment at his destruction of years of careful work, mixed with what seemed like relief that the temptation had been removed. They grounded him, naturally, and subjected him to long lectures about the proper channels for ethical concerns. But there was something in their eyes that suggested they understood his motivations, even if they couldn't acknowledge them openly. Dr. Vasquez's test, conducted with her own equipment, ended in disaster exactly as Elias had known it would. Her attempt to prevent the Scottish plague outbreak succeeded in the immediate term, but the saved villagers went on to spread a mutated form of the disease that proved far more deadly than the original. The intervention that was meant to save hundreds ended up killing thousands, before researchers in her timeline could develop countermeasures. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Dr. Vasquez was discredited, her research funding withdrawn, her reputation destroyed. The entire field of temporal mechanics fell under suspicion, with governments around the world imposing strict regulations on time-related research. The dream of chronological healing died almost as quickly as it had been born, killed by its own unintended consequences. Elias watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He had been right about the dangers, vindicated in his decision to destroy the time glove, but the validation brought him no joy. The knowledge that he carried, the understanding of what temporal intervention really meant, remained locked within him, a secret that would never be shared but would never be forgotten. In the months that followed, as the scientific community turned away from temporal research and his parents began working on safer projects, Elias gradually found his way back to something resembling a normal teenage life. The nightmares faded, the weight of responsibility lightened, and he began to engage with his studies and his peers in ways that felt natural rather than forced. But the experience had changed him fundamentally. He approached problems differently now, always considering not just immediate consequences, but long-term effects, always asking not just whether something could be done, but whether it should be done. He had learned the hardest lesson any human being could learn, that good intentions were not enough, that wisdom sometimes required accepting suffering, and that the greatest act of love was sometimes the refusal to act at all. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The Victorian railway station smelled of coal dust and old wood polish, despite being meticulously restored for tourists like Clara and her classmates. She pressed her nose against the glass display case, studying the brass buttons and faded conductors' uniforms within. While her history teacher droned on about steam engines and industrial progress, Clara's attention wandered to the sealed-off carriage at the far end of the platform, the one with the red rope barrier and the authorised personnel only sign. Clara Whitmore had always been drawn to places she wasn't supposed to go. At 16 she possessed an insatiable curiosity about the past, particularly the Victorian era. Her bedroom walls were covered with reproductions of old maps, daguerreotypes, and newspaper clippings from the 1800s. She devoured historical novels and spent her weekends haunting London's museums, much to her parents' bemusement. "Clara, stay with the group," Mrs. Henderson called out, but Clara was already slipping away, drawn like a moth to flame toward the forbidden carriage. The restoration had been so thorough that stepping into the compartment felt like entering a time capsule. Red velvet seats, brass fixtures, and wood panelling that gleamed despite its age. Everything was perfect. Too perfect, as if frozen in a moment that refused to die. She ran her fingers along the ornate woodwork, marvelling at the craftsmanship when something caught her eye. Wedged between two seat cushions was the glint of metal. Clara glanced back toward the platform where her classmates were still gathered around their teacher, then carefully extracted the object. It was a pocket watch, heavier than she expected, made of brass that had aged to a deep golden patina. Strange symbols were etched around its circumference. Not Roman numerals, but something far older and more mysterious. Celtic, perhaps, or even older than that. The watch face was cracked, its hands frozen at 3:17, but there was something compelling about it that made Clara's fingers itch to wind it. The crown turned easily under her touch, clicking with a satisfying mechanical precision. Once, twice, 3 times she wound it, and suddenly the hands began to move. The ticking was unnaturally loud, echoing in the small compartment like a heartbeat. The air around her began to shimmer, and the smell of coal dust grew stronger, more acrid. Steam seemed to be rising from nowhere, and the sounds of the modern world, traffic, air conditioning, her teacher's voice, began to fade. Clara tried to drop the watch, but her fingers wouldn't obey. The ticking grew thunderous, the steam thicker, and suddenly the world exploded in a cacophony of whistles, grinding metal, and shouting voices. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was the watch face, its hands spinning wildly backward. When awareness returned, Clara found herself standing on a railway platform, but not the quiet museum piece she had left. This platform teemed with life, porters hauling steamer trunks, vendors hawking hot pies and newspapers, gentlemen in top hats consulting their own pocket watches, and ladies in bustled skirts navigating the crowded space with practiced ease. The air was thick with genuine coal smoke and the acrid bite of steam from the massive locomotive that dominated the platform. The engine was magnificent and terrifying, a gleaming black beast with brass fittings, releasing great clouds of white steam that hissed and billowed around the wheels. Clara had seen steam trains in museums, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer presence of one in its prime. The ground vibrated beneath her feet with its power. "All aboard! All aboard the 3:20 to Birmingham!" a conductor shouted, his voice carrying over the din. Clara looked at the great station clock. 3:15. Her heart hammered as the impossible reality hit her. The pocket watch in her hand now read 3:15 as well, its hands moving steadily forward in perfect synchronization with the station clock. She was in 1842. Somehow, impossibly, she had travelled back in time. Clara stumbled backward, pressing against a pillar for support. The clothing, the architecture, the very quality of light, everything screamed authenticity in a way no restoration could achieve. The people around her moved with purpose, unaware that a girl from the 21st century stood among them, clutching a brass watch and fighting the urge to hyperventilate. A commotion near the locomotive caught her attention. 2 men in railway uniforms were having an urgent whispered conversation, their faces creased with worry. Clara edged closer, her modern clothes somehow unremarkable in the diverse crowd of travellers. "The brake line's been fitted wrong," one was saying. "Thompson swears he told the foreman, but—" "Shush!" The other man glanced around nervously. "The departure's already been delayed twice. Mr. Hardwick won't hear of another. But if those brakes fail, then God help us all, but I've got a family to feed and you do too. The train leaves in 5 minutes, faulty brakes or not." Clara's blood ran cold. She looked at the passengers boarding the magnificent locomotive. Well-dressed families, businessmen, workers heading home after a long day. Children pressed their faces against windows while their parents fussed with luggage. She thought of the museum placard she'd seen once, describing a railway disaster in the 1840s. The Larkspur Rail disaster. 43 dead, dozens injured, and the subsequent outcry that led to the first comprehensive railway safety laws. The conductor's whistle pierced the air. Steam hissed as the massive drive wheels began to turn. Clara watched, frozen, as the train pulled away from the platform carrying hundreds of innocent people toward their fate. But she wasn't frozen. She was Clara Whitmore, and she had read enough history to know what was about to happen. Without conscious thought, she ran toward the signal box at the end of the platform where a lever stood that could divert trains onto the maintenance siding. "Hey! You can't!" A railway worker started to protest as Clara shoved past him and threw her full weight against the heavy lever. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a grinding clank. The points shifted just as the train approached. Instead of continuing down the main line toward the curved bridge where history said the faulty brakes would prove catastrophic, the locomotive diverted onto the siding and rolled safely to a stop. Clara collapsed against the signal box, breathing heavily as chaos erupted around her. Passengers disembarked in confusion. Railway workers ran back and forth shouting orders, and someone was demanding to know who had operated the points without authorization. "It was the girl," someone shouted. "The girl in the strange clothes." Before Clara could escape, she found herself surrounded by a crowd of grateful passengers and bewildered railway officials. Word spread quickly through the station that the mysterious girl had somehow known to divert the train, preventing what the engineers now confirmed would have been a catastrophic brake failure on the curved viaduct outside town. "You saved us all, child," a well-dressed gentleman said, pressing a gold sovereign into her palm. "However did you know?" Clara could only stammer incoherent replies as more people pressed forward to shake her hand and praise her quick thinking. Someone mentioned contacting the newspapers. Others spoke of divine intervention. All Clara could think about was the terrible certainty that she had just changed history in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Over the following days, Clara found herself a reluctant celebrity in Victorian Britain. The story of the miracle girl who saved the 320 to Birmingham spread through newspapers across the country. She was housed temporarily with a kindly station master and his wife, who assumed she was a runaway from some unfortunate circumstances. Her modern clothes were replaced with proper Victorian dress, and she learned to navigate the complex social expectations of the era. But as the days passed, Clara began to notice things that chilled her to the bone. In the newspapers, she read accounts of railway accidents that she was sure hadn't happened in her own timeline. Workers crushed by improperly secured cargo. Children maimed in factory accidents that should have been prevented by safety laws that apparently didn't exist. Most troubling of all, she discovered that the Larkspur Rail disaster, the tragedy she had prevented, had been the catalyst for sweeping reforms in her own timeline. In her history books back home, the disaster had shocked the nation and prompted Parliament to pass the Railway Safety Act of 1843. Better braking systems, improved working conditions for railway employees, restrictions on child labour in dangerous industries, all of it traced back to the public outrage following the deaths of 43 people on that April afternoon. By preventing those deaths, Clara had prevented the reforms that would have saved thousands of others. The full weight of this realisation hit her when she met Thomas Aldrich, a 12-year-old boy who worked on the railway tracks. Small for his age but quick-witted, Thomas had been assigned to watch for Clara after she'd been staying with the station master's family. He showed her around the rail yards, proud of his job despite the obvious dangers. "Aren't you frightened?" Clara asked, as they watched workers manoeuvre heavy equipment without any safety protocols she recognised. Thomas shrugged. "Course I am. But Dar says fear keeps you alive in this work. Lost me brother last year when a coupling chain snapped." He said it matter-of-factly, as if accepting that industrial work claimed young lives as a simple cost of progress. In Clara's timeline, those coupling chains had been redesigned after the Larkspur disaster. The public outcry had forced railway companies to invest in safety equipment they had previously deemed too expensive. Children like Thomas worked in much safer conditions, or better yet, attended school instead of risking their lives in dangerous labour. Clara's friendship with Thomas deepened over the weeks. Despite their age difference and the century between their births, they connected over their shared intelligence and curiosity about the world. Thomas was illiterate but possessed a sharp mind and an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. Clara found herself teaching him to read using discarded newspapers, watching his face light up as he deciphered his first words. But her joy in his progress was constantly shadowed by the knowledge that she had condemned him and countless others to live in a world without the safety protections that should have existed. Every day she remained in the past, more preventable accidents occurred. More families received news that their fathers, sons or brothers wouldn't be coming home. The crisis came 3 weeks after her arrival. Thomas was working near the main line when a poorly secured rail car broke loose and rolled backward down a slight incline. In Clara's timeline, emergency brake systems installed after the Larkspur disaster would have stopped it immediately. Here, there was no such system. Clara watched in horror from the platform as Thomas tried to outrun the runaway car. He almost made it. Almost. The car clipped him as he dove aside, crushing his left leg and trapping him beneath its wheels. She ran to him as railway workers shouted for help and someone was sent to fetch a doctor. Thomas lay unconscious, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, blood pooling beneath the massive iron wheels. Clara knelt beside him, taking his hand and whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. The doctor, when he arrived, was grim. "The leg will have to come off, I'm afraid. Too much damage to save it." As Clara sat vigil by Thomas's bedside in the days that followed, watching him struggle with pain and fever, she came to a terrible resolution. She had to undo what she had done. She had to let the Larkspur rail disaster happen. The decision tormented her. She would be condemning 43 specific people to death, people she had met, people who had thanked her for saving their lives, but by preventing their deaths, she had condemned thousands of others to suffer in an unregulated industrial system that treated human life as acceptable collateral damage. Clara spent her nights walking the empty railway platforms, the brass pocket watch heavy in her hand, wrestling with the most agonising moral choice of her life. Was it right to let people die for the greater good? Did she have the right to play God with the timeline? But then she would return to Thomas, lying pale and feverish in his bed, and remember all the other Thomas Aldrichs throughout Britain who were suffering because the reforms that should have protected them had never come to pass. The decision became easier when she learned that the railway company was planning to run another train over the same route, with the same faulty brake system that had almost caused disaster before. They had quietly fixed the specific brake line that had failed, but the systemic problems remained. Another tragedy was inevitable. It was just a matter of when and where. Clara made her choice. She waited until night, then slipped out of the station master's house and made her way to the rail yard. Thomas, despite his injury, had insisted on helping when she explained what she intended to do. He understood better than anyone the cost of the industrial system they lived under. "You're sure about this?" he asked, as they approached the signal box. His crutch made soft sounds against the gravel ballast between the rails. "No," Clara admitted, "but I'm sure about what happens if I don't." The midnight freight was due through in 20 minutes. The same route, the same faulty braking system, carrying a crew of 5 men. Not passengers this time, but railway workers whose deaths would still serve as the catalyst for reform. Clara and Thomas took positions in the signal box. When the train appeared in the distance, its headlamp cutting through the darkness, Clara forced herself to leave the points aligned for the main line. The locomotive thundered past them, sparks flying from its wheels, heading toward the curved viaduct where physics and mechanical failure would write their inevitable equation in blood and twisted metal. The crash, when it came, was audible even from 2 miles away. The grinding shriek of metal, the thunderous impact, and then the terrible silence that followed. Clara sank to her knees in the signal box, tears streaming down her face, as Thomas put a gentle hand on her shoulder. By morning the news had spread throughout Britain. The Larkspur rail disaster, they called it. 5 railway workers dead when their freight train's brakes failed on the curved viaduct outside town. The newspapers were filled with outrage and demands for investigation. Parliament promised immediate action. Railway companies, facing public fury, began implementing safety measures they had resisted for decades. Clara watched it all unfold with a mixture of relief and crushing guilt. The reforms came swiftly this time. New braking systems, safety protocols, limits on working hours, and restrictions on child labour. Within 6 months, the industrial landscape of Britain had been transformed. Thomas, fitted with a wooden leg, was pulled from dangerous track work and given a position in the signal box, where his quick mind and knowledge of the railway system made him invaluable. But Clara couldn't forget the faces of the 5 men who had died, men she could have saved with a simple movement of a lever. She had chosen the greater good over individual lives, and the weight of that choice aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. 6 months after the disaster, as Clara sat reading to Thomas in the station office, the brass pocket watch in her pocket began to tick again. She had carried it every day since her arrival, but it had remained silent and still. Now it pulsed with the same strange energy she had felt in the museum carriage. "It's time," she said simply, though Thomas couldn't possibly understand what she meant. The watch grew warm against her palm as the hands began spinning forward, faster and faster. The familiar shimmer filled the air, and steam that belonged to no visible source began to rise around her. Thomas called her name, but his voice was already fading, drowned out by the thunderous ticking that filled her world. The last thing Clara saw of 1842 was Thomas's concerned face, and she realised with a pang that she would miss him more than anyone else she was leaving behind. When the world stopped spinning, Clara found herself back in the restored railway carriage, surrounded by the pristine Victorian replica and the distant sounds of modern London traffic. Her classmates were still gathered around their teacher on the platform outside, apparently unaware that she'd been gone at all. The pocket watch in her hand had stopped once more, its hands frozen at 3:17. Clara stumbled out of the carriage on unsteady legs, her mind reeling with the transition back to her own time. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, more artificial. The carefully preserved station felt like a stage set compared to the vibrant reality she had left behind. "There you are, Clara," Mrs. Henderson called out. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to. Come along, we're heading to the exhibition hall next." Clara nodded mutely and rejoined her group, but her attention was drawn to a brass plaque mounted on the wall near the sealed carriage. She had walked past it dozens of times during school trips to various museums, but now she read it with new eyes. The Larkspur Rail disaster of April 15th, 1842 claimed the lives of 5 railway workers when a freight train's brakes failed on the curved viaduct 2 miles east of this station. The public outrage following this tragedy led directly to the Railway Safety Act of 1843, which established comprehensive safety standards for British railways and saved countless lives in the decades that followed. The disaster is considered a turning point in industrial safety reform. Below the main text was a smaller inscription. This carriage has been preserved as it appeared in 1842, when a young girl's quick thinking prevented what could have been an even greater tragedy. Her identity was never conclusively established, and she disappeared from historical records shortly after the disaster. She remains one of the great mysteries of Victorian railway history. Clara stared at the plaque for a long time, her fingers tracing the brass letters. She had done it. She had set history back on its proper course, ensuring that the reforms happened when they were supposed to happen. The cost had been terrible. 5 lives that she could have saved, but the alternative had been far worse. As her class moved on to the exhibition hall, Clara lingered for a moment, looking back at the sealed carriage where her journey had begun. The pocket watch was silent in her hand, but she could feel its potential, as if it were merely sleeping rather than dead. She wondered if it would activate again someday, if she would be called upon once more to make impossible choices about life and death and the proper course of history. The weight of the watch was heavier than gold, heavier than brass, heavy with the knowledge of what she had done and what she might be called upon to do again. Clara slipped it into her jacket pocket and hurried to catch up with her classmates, carrying with her the terrible wisdom of someone who had learned that progress always comes at a price, and sometimes the price must be paid in blood. She looked different now, her friends would say later, older, more thoughtful, as if she carried some invisible burden that aged her beyond her 16 years. Clara never spoke of where she had been or what she'd seen, but she developed an intense interest in social justice and workers' rights that would shape the rest of her life. Years later, as a historical researcher and labour rights advocate, Clara would sometimes find herself studying accounts of industrial accidents and thinking about the individuals behind the statistics. Each safety regulation had been written in someone's blood, each reform born from tragedy that might have been prevented if only the political will had existed before the disaster struck. She kept the pocket watch in a place of honour on her desk, a reminder of the terrible mathematics of progress, and the burden of those who understand that sometimes letting tragedy happen is the only way to prevent even greater tragedies. The watch never ticked again in her lifetime, but Clara never stopped listening for it, never stopped wondering if history might someday call upon her again to make choices too heavy for any one person to bear. In her final years, Clara would donate the watch to the same railway museum where she had found it, ensuring that it would be there waiting in the sealed carriage for whoever might need it next. The circle would continue, as circles must, carrying its burden of impossible choices and necessary sacrifices through time, waiting for the next person strong enough to bear the weight of shaping history. The brass plaque never mentioned that the mysterious girl who prevented the greater tragedy was the same person who later allowed the lesser one to happen. Some stories are too complex for brass and bronze to tell, too heavy with moral ambiguity for the simple certainties of historical commemoration. But the watch remembers, patient and silent, waiting for the next moment when time itself might need to be bent to preserve the greater good. And in the quiet spaces between seconds, between the ticks of ordinary time, Clara Whitmore's choice echoes through history, a reminder that heroism sometimes means letting tragedy happen, and that the greatest acts of courage are often those that no one will ever know were committed at all. The weight of her decision would follow Clara through every day of her remaining life. In university, studying history and economics, she found herself drawn obsessively to the industrial period, writing papers on railway development and labour reform that her professors praised for their unusual depth of understanding. She could write with authority about the smell of coal smoke and the precise sound of steam engines, because she had lived among them. But more than that, she understood viscerally how individual human lives intersected with the great movements of history. Her doctoral thesis on the social cost of industrial progress became a seminal work in the field, though Clara could never explain to her academic colleagues why certain details felt so personal, so immediate. She described the cramped conditions of railway workers with the precision of someone who had seen Thomas struggle with his injuries, and she analysed the political dynamics of reform with the insight of someone who had watched Parliament respond to public outrage in real time. But it was in her private moments that the true cost of her knowledge revealed itself. Clara would wake from dreams where she heard the grinding crash of the freight train, saw again the faces of the 5 men whose deaths she had chosen not to prevent. She carried their names with her always. William Hartwell, age 34, father of 3, James Morrison, 26, recently married, David Chen, 41, supporting his elderly parents, Michael O'Brien, 19, saving money to bring his sister over from Ireland, and Samuel Thompson, 52, who had worked the railways for 27 years and was planning to retire at Christmas. Clara had researched each of them meticulously after returning to her own time, finding their names in the newspaper accounts and parish records. She felt she owed them that much, to know exactly who had died for the greater good she had chosen. Their faces haunted her dreams, but she never allowed herself the luxury of believing she had made the wrong choice. The mathematics of mortality were clear. 5 lives lost to save thousands. It was the arithmetic of progress, brutal and necessary. In her 40s, Clara established a foundation dedicated to workplace safety. Using her inherited wealth, she had never married, never felt she deserved that kind of personal happiness, to fund research into industrial accident prevention. The Clara Whitmore Institute became a leading voice in occupational health, though its founder never spoke publicly about her own experiences with industrial tragedy. She returned to the Railway Museum regularly over the years, always making excuses to visit alone. Standing before the sealed carriage where her journey had begun, Clara would sometimes take out the brass pocket watch she still carried and hold it up to the light, searching its scratched surface for some sign of the power that had once transported her through time. The watch remained stubbornly mundane in her hands, its mechanism frozen, its hands pointing eternally to 3:17. But Clara could feel something sleeping within it, a potential that hummed just below the threshold of perception. She began to understand that the watch was not just a tool of time travel, but something far more complex, a burden that passed from one person to another when history required intervention. Her research into the watch's origins led her down increasingly obscure historical paths. She found references to similar timepieces in medieval chronicles, always associated with individuals who had appeared suddenly during moments of historical crisis, made crucial interventions and then vanished without explanation. A mysterious woman who had warned the defenders of Constantinople about a weakness in their walls, a young man who had prevented a fire that would have destroyed most of medieval Paris, a child who had stopped a plague ship from docking in Venice. The pattern was always the same. Someone appeared at a crucial moment, made a choice that preserved the greater good at terrible personal cost, and then disappeared from history. Clara began to suspect that she was part of something far larger than a single journey through time, a hidden network of guardians who moved through history, making the impossible choices that shaped the course of human progress. As she aged, Clara found herself spending more time at the museum, as if waiting for something. She arranged to have herself buried with detailed instructions about the pocket watch, ensuring it would be returned to the sealed carriage after her death. She wrote letters to be opened only by whoever next found the watch, trying to prepare them for the burden they would inherit. "Time travel is not an adventure," she wrote in one such letter. "It is a responsibility heavier than any human should bear alone. But if you're reading this, then history has chosen you as it once chose me. The watch does not transport you through time randomly. It takes you where you are needed, when you are needed. Trust your instincts. Understand that heroism sometimes means allowing tragedy to happen. And remember that every life you touch, whether saved or lost, carries equal weight in the scales of eternity." Clara died at 73, found peacefully in her study surrounded by books and papers, the brass pocket watch clutched in her hand. The museum staff, following her instructions, returned the watch to the sealed carriage, placing it carefully between the same seat cushions where Clara had first discovered it so many decades earlier. But the watch's story did not end with Clara's death. 3 years later, during another school field trip, another curious student found herself drawn to the forbidden carriage. Sarah Chen, 17, fascinated by early 20th century history and the social upheavals that had shaped the modern world, slipped past the barriers and discovered the brass timepiece gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the carriage windows. The strange symbols around its circumference seemed to pulse with hidden meaning as Sarah picked it up, feeling its unusual weight and the odd warmth that seemed to emanate from within the metal itself. Without fully understanding why, she found herself winding the crown, listening to the increasingly rapid ticking that filled the small compartment. The last thing Sarah saw before the world dissolved in steam and light was the watch face, its hands spinning wildly backward, carrying her toward whatever moment in history required her intervention. Behind her, Clara's letters waited in the museum archives, ready to guide another reluctant guardian through the terrible mathematics of shaping time. And so the cycle continued, as it always had and always would, with each guardian carrying forward the knowledge that progress demands sacrifice, that heroism is often invisible, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing tragedy to happen so that something better might be born from its ashes. The brass pocket watch ticked on through time, patient and persistent, waiting for each new soul brave enough to bear the weight of history's most impossible choices. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The July heat pressed against the windows of Grandmother Thorne's countryside house like a living thing. Eliza wiped sweat from her brow as she climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the attic, each step creaking under her weight. Her parents had insisted she spend the summer here while they travelled abroad for work, and though she loved her grandmother dearly, the old woman house felt like a museum of forgotten things. "Just old wives' tales," she muttered to herself, echoing what she'd told her grandmother the night before when the elderly woman had warned her away from the attic. "Some things are better left undisturbed, child," Grandmother Thorne had said, her weathered hands trembling as she gripped her teacup. "Our family has a long history with things that shouldn't be touched." But Eliza had always been too curious for her own good, and at 16 she considered herself far too rational to believe in family curses or haunted heirlooms. The attic stretched longer than she had expected, filled with trunks, old furniture, and cobweb-draped relics. As she made her way deeper into the space, something caught her eye, a large shape in the corner covered by a paint-stained sheet. When she pulled it away, dust billowed up, revealing an enormous mirror. The glass was old and clouded, held in an ornate frame that might have been beautiful once but was now tarnished black with age. A spider web of cracks ran across the surface, distorting her reflection into fragmented pieces. The frame was carved with intricate symbols, spirals and crescents that seemed to shift when she looked at them directly. Unable to resist, she began wiping the dust from the mirror's surface with the hem of her t-shirt. The glass felt strangely warm under her touch, and as she cleaned it, her reflection became clearer. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, the way her image seemed to shimmer and blur at the edges. But as she continued cleaning, the distortion grew more pronounced. Her reflection appeared to be moving independently, turning its head when she stood still, smiling when her face was serious. "What the hell?" she breathed, stepping back, but her reflection remained in place for a heartbeat longer before snapping back to match her movements. The mirror began to glow. It started as a faint luminescence around the edges, then spread inward until the entire surface pulsed with silver light. The cracks seemed to seal themselves, the glass becoming perfectly smooth, and in that perfect surface she no longer saw the dusty attic behind her. Instead, she saw a room lit by flickering candles, with rough wooden walls and a small barred window. She reached out instinctively, her fingertips barely grazing the glass, and suddenly the world lurched sideways. Cold air rushed past her face as reality folded in on itself. When the spinning stopped and her feet touched solid ground, she found herself standing in the exact room she'd seen in the mirror. The candles were real now, their flames dancing in clay holders. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. Through the barred window she could see a slice of sky that was the wrong colour, not the bright blue of summer but the pale grey of early dawn. Heart pounding, she moved toward the window and peered out. The landscape was completely wrong. Gone were the rolling hills of her grandmother's neighbourhood. Instead, she looked out on a small village of wooden buildings clustered around a central common. People moved between the houses dressed in long, dark clothing. Men in wide-brimmed hats, women in full skirts and white caps. It looked like a living history museum, except there were no modern conveniences anywhere. No power lines, no cars, no paved roads. "This isn't possible," she whispered, backing away from the window. Her voice sounded too loud and too modern. The sound of footsteps and voices grew louder outside, and fragments of conversation chilled her blood. Seen the devil's work before. Not natural the way she appeared. Must be examined by the magistrates. The door opened with a groan of old hinges, and a stern-faced man stepped inside, dressed in black with a white collar. Behind him came two other men, and a woman whose white cap pinched her features. "So," the first man said with authority, "this is the creature that appeared in Goodwife Miller's barn." "I'm not a creature," Eliza said, then immediately regretted speaking. Her voice was too clear, too confident, too modern. "Listen to how she speaks," the woman whispered, bold as brass with no proper deference. The leading man stepped closer, studying her with eyes like chips of flint. "What is your name, girl?" "From whence do you come?" "Eliza Thorne. I'm not sure how I got here." "Eliza Thorne. A strange name for these parts. And your attire—" He gestured at her jeans and NASA t-shirt with obvious disgust. "What manner of garments are these?" Before she could answer, one of the other men spoke up. "Magistrate Hawthorne, mark how her hair is uncovered, how she displays herself without shame." Magistrate Hawthorne. The name sent a chill through her. She'd studied the Salem witch trials in school, remembered reading about John Hathorne, one of the men who had condemned innocent people to death for witchcraft. "Your sudden appearance in the night, your strange attire, your bold manner of speaking, all point to one conclusion," Hawthorne said grimly. The word he didn't say hung in the air like smoke. Witch. They led her to a jail in the basement of a meeting house, a single room with stone walls and mouldy straw scattered across the floor. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with finality. Hours passed in the dim cell. When the door finally opened, she saw a young man about her own age carrying a wooden bowl and cup, dressed in simple brown clothing. His face was kind but worried. "I brought you some porridge and water," he said quietly. "They said you hadn't eaten since your capture." "Thank you," she said gratefully. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Nathaniel. Nathaniel Prescott. I serve in the magistrate's house." He paused, then added quietly, "And you should know. They're saying terrible things about you in the village." "What kind of accusations?" "They say you appeared from thin air in Miller's barn, that you spoke strange words and caused his cow to dry up. Others claim they've seen you in their dreams, tormenting them. They say you're in league with Satan himself." None of that is true. I didn't do anything to anyone. I believe you, Nathaniel said, surprising her. But it doesn't matter what I believe. Once the accusations start in a place like Salem Village, they spread like fire in dry timber. Salem Village, she repeated, her worst fears confirmed. Then you know how dangerous your situation is. He glanced toward the door. I shouldn't be talking to you like this. Why are you helping me? Because I've seen this before. Not exactly this, but strange things happen in Salem Village. People disappear. Others appear where they shouldn't be, wearing clothes that don't belong to any place I know. Always near the old barn at the edge of Miller's property. Her heart began to race. What do you mean? There was a girl, maybe 2 years past, found wandering the woods dressed in strange garments like yours. She spoke strangely too. The magistrates had her examined, and she was hanged as a witch within the month. But others have appeared? Like me? A few over the years. Local folk say the barn is cursed, that the devil uses it as a gateway. Most who are found there don't survive long enough to tell their stories. The barn, the glimmer she'd seen. Nathaniel, is there something strange about that barn? He looked at her sharply. Why do you ask? Because I think it might be connected to how I got here. The devil's glass, he whispered, fear in his eyes. The devil's what? There are stories about a cursed mirror hidden in Miller's barn. They say it shows visions of other places, other times. Some claim it's a window to hell itself. A mirror. Her heart pounded with sudden hope. Have you seen it? Once. I glimpsed something in the loft that caught the light strangely, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw elsewhere. Another place entirely, with buildings taller than church spires and strange lights that burned without flame. He was describing her world. When does it appear? Only at night, and only when the moon is full. It fades with the dawn. He studied her face. You truly believe this glass is connected to your appearance here? I know it is. When is the next full moon? A fortnight hence, perhaps a bit more. Will you help me reach it? For a long moment he didn't answer. If I help you and we're caught, they'll hang us both. If you don't help me, they'll hang me anyway. And probably find some excuse to hang you too. These trials don't end with just one death, Nathaniel. Finally he nodded. 2 weeks until the full moon. God help us both. The days that followed were a nightmare of waiting and growing dread. Each morning brought new accusations, new arrests. Through Nathaniel, she learned that charges against her were multiplying daily. She had supposedly been seen flying through the night sky, tormenting children in their sleep, spoiling milk and beer. They're building a case against you, Nathaniel warned during one visit. Magistrate Hawthorne plans to have you examined by the full court within the week. How long until the full moon? 8 days, and the court examination is set for 6 days hence. 2 days. She would have only 2 days between her trial and her chance at escape. The day of her examination arrived grey and cold. The courtroom was packed with spectators, their faces showing curiosity, fear, and barely contained excitement. Magistrate Hawthorne took his place at a high table. You're Eliza Thorne. You stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of entering into a covenant with Satan, and of tormenting the good people of Salem Village. How do you answer these charges? I'm not a witch, she said clearly. I haven't made any covenants with anyone. A murmur ran through the crowd at her bold denial. Yet the evidence against you is overwhelming, said one of the other magistrates. Your sudden appearance, your strange attire, your bold manner, all point to supernatural influence. She realized she was fighting a battle she couldn't win with words. In their world view, everything about her was wrong. I want to confess, she said suddenly. Hawthorne leaned forward eagerly. You admit your guilt? I admit that I'm not from this place or time. I admit that I arrived here through supernatural means. But I'm not in league with Satan. I'm just lost. Explain yourself. I came through a mirror. There's a cursed glass in Miller's barn that serves as a doorway between different times and places. The courtroom erupted in excited whispers. She had given them an admission of supernatural involvement. This mirror, describe it, one magistrate demanded. It's large, with an ornate frame hidden in the barn's loft. It only appears during the full moon, and it shows visions of other places and times. Hawthorne and his fellow magistrates exchanged meaningful glances. And you claim this glass is not of Satan's making? I don't know who made it or why, but I don't think it's evil. All that is beyond godly understanding comes from the father of lies, Hawthorne declared. You have confessed to trafficking with supernatural forces. The only question that remains is the identity of your confederates. And there it was, the trap. I don't have any confederates. I used the mirror alone, by accident. Impossible. Someone taught you the glass's secrets. I'm telling you the truth. There is no one else. Hawthorne nodded to someone behind her, and two large men approached. Since you refuse to name your confederates willingly, perhaps some time in contemplation will loosen your tongue. The court will reconvene tomorrow to hear your full confession. Back in her cell, she paced frantically. One more day until they expected her confession, complete with names. If she couldn't give them names, the torture would begin. Near midnight, Nathaniel appeared at her cell door, looking haggard but determined. "Tomorrow night," he whispered urgently. "The moon will be full tomorrow night." "But the court? We can't wait any longer. It has to be tomorrow night." He pressed something small and metal through the bars. A crude lockpick. "Keep this hidden. When you hear the church bell toll midnight, use it on the lock. I'll create a distraction to draw away the guard." The next day crawled by. She was brought before the court again, and when she refused to name confederates who didn't exist, Hawthorne's face darkened with anger. "Your stubbornness serves no one but Satan. If you will not confess willingly, other methods will be employed." As the hours crawled toward midnight, she clutched the lockpick and tried to calm her racing heart. Outside her window, she could see the moon rising full and bright. The church bell began to toll midnight. Her hands shook as she worked the crude pick in the lock. For several terrifying minutes, nothing happened except the scraping of metal on metal. Then something clicked. The lock opened. She crept through the building and out into the moonlit village square. She had made it perhaps halfway across when she heard the shouts behind her. "The witch has escaped! The witch is free!" Light blazed in windows throughout the village. She ran then, racing down the path toward Miller's farm with the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind her. The barn loomed ahead. She burst through the door and looked frantically for a way to reach the loft. A ladder leaned against the far wall and she dragged it to the centre of the barn, positioning it beneath something glimmering above. The mirror was exactly as she remembered it, large and ornate, but now whole and perfect, its surface reflecting not the barn around her, but her grandmother's attic. Behind her, the barn door slammed open and torches blazed in the entrance. There she is! The witch seeks to return to her master. She climbed the ladder frantically as men poured into the barn below. She reached the loft and threw herself toward the mirror, just as hands grabbed at her legs. The surface was like liquid silver under her palms. She could feel it beginning to draw her in, but something was wrong. The grip on her ankle tightened, and she looked down to see Nathaniel, his face streaked with tears. "Take me with you," he pleaded. "Please, I can't stay here. They'll kill me for helping you." She could hear the villagers climbing the ladder behind him, could see torch flames reflecting off raised weapons. In seconds, they would be in the loft. The decision had to be made in a split second. "Hold on," she whispered, and reached down to grab his wrist. The moment their hands connected, the mirror's surface exploded with light. The silver liquid became turbulent, and she felt the pull intensify. But something was fighting it, a resistance that felt like trying to push through thick honey. Behind Nathaniel, Hawthorne's head emerged from the ladder opening. "Seize them! Do not let Satan's servants escape!" The mirror was struggling with their combined weight. They were sinking into it, but slowly. Too slowly. Then, as if responding to their desperate need, the mirror made a decision. The resistance vanished all at once, and they plunged through the silver surface. The last thing Eliza saw was Hawthorne's reaching hand before the world dissolved into spinning light and impossible cold. The transit felt longer this time, more violent, like being caught in a tornado made of light and sound. Then, with a jarring impact, they tumbled onto the dusty floor of her grandmother's attic. They lay gasping, trying to process what had happened. The sudden silence was almost as disorienting as the magical transit had been. She could hear the familiar sounds of the modern world: air conditioning, distant traffic, a neighbour's lawnmower. She sat up slowly and looked around the attic. Everything was exactly as she had left it, but the mirror itself was changed. The great glass was fractured now with deep, violent fractures. Pieces of the surface had fallen out, leaving jagged holes. As she watched, another shard broke free and crashed to the floor. "What? Where are we?" Nathaniel's voice was small and frightened. "We're in my time, my world. We made it. He struggled to his feet, moving to the small window. What he saw there made him stagger backward in shock. Paved roads, power lines, cars moving in the distance, houses with large glass windows. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," he whispered. "What manner of place is this?" "It's 2024. You're in the future, Nathaniel. More than 300 years in the future." He turned to stare at her, his face pale. 300? But how am I still alive? How are you... Understanding dawned. "You weren't from Salem at all. You were from this time." "Yes. I was visiting my grandmother when I found the mirror. I never meant to go to Salem." He was quiet for a long time. "Then I'm alone. Everyone I ever knew is dead, have been dead for centuries." The pain in his voice broke her heart. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you what it would mean." "You saved my life," he said simply. "Better to be alive in a strange world than dead in a familiar one." A loud crack from the mirror made them both turn. The frame itself began to sag and buckle. Whatever force had held the mirror together was failing. "It's breaking," Nathaniel observed. "Yes. I don't think it can be used again. We destroyed it by forcing it to take both of us." The sound of a car door slamming outside made her freeze. Her grandmother was home. "Someone's coming," she said urgently. "You need to hide." But before she could figure out where, her grandmother's voice called up from below. "Eliza? Dear, are you up there? I thought I heard voices." "I'm here, grandmother," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "Well, come down when you're ready. I've brought some groceries." Eliza looked at Nathaniel desperately, then made her way downstairs. Her grandmother was in the kitchen unpacking bags. "You were up there for quite a while," Grandmother Thorne said. "Find anything interesting?" "Just an old mirror," Eliza said carefully. Her grandmother's hand stilled. Slowly she turned to face Eliza, and there was something in her expression that made Eliza's stomach clench. "You didn't touch it, did you?" The question hit Eliza like a physical blow. You know about the mirror?" Grandmother Thorne sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of her 87 years. "I was wondering when this day would come, when you'd be old enough, curious enough to find it despite my warnings. You know what it is. I know what it was. The Salem mirror, we've called it for generations. A doorway through time created by... Well, no one knows. But it's been in our family for over 3 centuries. Since Salem. Since Salem. You see, dear, our family has always had a complicated relationship with that time and place. Eliza Thorne wasn't the first of our family to travel through that mirror. She was the last, until now. You're named after her." The room spun. "That's impossible." "Is it? You've seen the mirror work." Her grandmother studied her face. "You did use it. You went somewhere." "I went to Salem during the trials. I was accused of witchcraft, nearly hanged. I barely escaped. And you brought someone back with you. I can sense another presence in the house." Eliza stared in shock. "How did you—" "The mirror calls to our blood, dear. Those it touches carry a trace of its magic forever after." Grandmother Thorne stood up slowly. "You'd better bring your friend downstairs. If he's going to live in this world, he'll need to learn how to navigate it." With no other choice, Eliza led her grandmother up to the attic, where Nathaniel was still huddled by the window. He looked up when they entered, his face cycling through fear, confusion, and desperate hope. "Nathaniel Prescott," her grandmother said gently. "Welcome to the 21st century." He goggled at her. "You know who I am. I know you helped my granddaughter escape Salem Village, at great risk to yourself. I know you've sacrificed everything to save her life, and I know you're very far from home." Tears began to flow down Nathaniel's cheeks. "I am lost. Everything I knew is gone. Everyone I loved is dead. I don't understand this world." "You will," Grandmother Thorne said firmly. "It won't be easy, but you will learn. Humans are remarkably adaptable." She turned to look at the shattered mirror. "It's finished, isn't it?" "Yes," Eliza said. "Bringing both of us through broke it completely." "Good. It's caused enough pain over the centuries. Perhaps it's time for it to rest." Over the following weeks, Grandmother Thorne began the impossible task of explaining 3 centuries of history to Nathaniel. He was overwhelmed, but intelligent and adaptable. Slowly, gradually, he began to accept these new realities. The practical concerns were more immediate. He would need identification, education, a way to survive in the modern world. Grandmother Thorne seemed to have anticipated this. "There are people who specialize in helping those who need new identities," she explained mysteriously. It will take time and money, but it can be done. But what will I do? Nathaniel asked desperately. How will I survive? You'll learn, Eliza said firmly. We'll help you. And so began one of the strangest chapters of Eliza's life. Over the weeks that followed, she and her grandmother worked to introduce Nathaniel to the modern world. They started with basics: electric lights, flush toilets, packaged foods. Then more complex concepts: modern money, job possibilities, social interaction. Nathaniel proved to be a quick study, though the process was often overwhelming. There were days when she found him staring out windows with profound sadness, mourning not just the people he'd known, but the entire way of life that had defined him. But there were good days too. The first time he successfully made a phone call, operated a television, tasted ice cream, these small victories brought genuine joy to his face. As summer ended and fall approached, they began to plan for the future. Nathaniel would need more than survival skills. He would need purpose. I think you'd make a good teacher, Eliza said one evening. You have patience, and you A teacher of what? History. You lived through part of it. That gives you a perspective no one else can have. The idea intrigued him, and they began exploring what it would take for him to pursue education, to learn enough about the modern world to eventually teach others about the past he had personally experienced. It was during one of these planning sessions that Eliza first noticed something strange happening with mirrors in the house. Not the Salem mirror, that lay in pieces, completely inactive. But other mirrors sometimes seemed to show her reflection doing things she wasn't doing. At first she thought it was imagination, but the incidents became more frequent. One morning, while brushing her teeth, she watched in horror as her reflection continued brushing long after she'd stopped. "Grandmother," she said that afternoon, "I think something's wrong with me." She explained about the mirrors, about the reflection that seemed to have a life of its own. Her grandmother listened without interruption, her expression growing concerned. "Show me," Grandmother Thorne said finally. They went to the hallway mirror, and Eliza stood in front of it. For a moment, nothing unusual happened. Then her reflection smiled, a cold smile, nothing like any expression she'd ever worn. Her grandmother made a soft sound of distress. "Oh, my dear child, I was afraid this might happen. What's happening to me? The mirror didn't just transport you through time, it left a mark on you, a connection. And when you forced it to bring both of you back, I think a piece of you may have been left behind." The words chilled her. Left behind where? In Salem, in 1692. A part of your soul trapped in that time and place. Her grandmother took her hands. The Eliza you see in the mirrors, that's the part of you that never made it home. But I did make it home. I'm here. Most of you is here, but not all. And the longer time passes, the more that trapped piece will try to assert itself. What does that mean? What will happen to me? I don't know. This has never happened before. But I suspect that eventually you'll have to choose between the part of you that's here and the part that's still there. That night, Eliza lay awake staring at the ceiling, afraid to close her eyes. Every mirror had become a potential threat. Nathaniel knocked softly on her door around midnight. "May I come in?" She sat up as he entered. "What's wrong?" "I've been thinking about what your grandmother told us, about part of you being trapped in my time." He sat on the edge of the bed. "If part of you is still there, what does that mean for what happened after we left?" The question struck her like a physical blow. "You think my presence there might have changed things?" "I think we may have left behind more than just a piece of your soul. We may have left behind evidence that witchcraft was real, that the mirror truly was a gateway." She felt sick. The broken glass. When the mirror shattered after we went through it, pieces must have fallen in Salem too. Pieces that the magistrates would have found. Pieces that would have seemed to confirm everything they believed. His face was grim. "I fear we may have made things worse, that our escape may have cost other innocent lives. The weight of this possibility was crushing. There has to be something we can do." But she knew it wasn't possible. The mirror was destroyed. There was no way back to Salem, no way to undo whatever damage their escape might have caused. The next few weeks passed in a haze of guilt and growing paranoia. The incidents with mirrors became more frequent and disturbing. Her reflection began to mouth words she couldn't hear, to gesture frantically. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she could hear faint voices calling her name from very far away. The fragment of her soul wasn't just trying to communicate, it was trying to come home, and it was getting stronger. She would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, see figures in colonial dress at the edge of her sight. The temperature would drop suddenly. Electronics began to malfunction in her presence. "It's getting worse," she told her grandmother one morning after waking to find her bedroom window covered in frost, despite the warm October weather. "I know, dear. The connection between you and the trapped fragment is strengthening. It's trying to pull you back. But the mirror is destroyed. How can it pull me back? The mirror was a tool, not the source of the power. The real magic lives in our bloodline. Strong emotion, desperate need can sometimes create its own doorways. You think I might be pulled back to Salem even without the mirror? I think you're going to have to make a choice soon. Either find a way to recall that lost piece of yourself, or risk being torn apart by the conflict between past and present. How do I recall something trapped 3 centuries in the past? Perhaps the answer lies not in bringing that piece of you home, but in accepting that it belongs where it is, in letting it go." That night she dreamed of Salem again, but this time she was watching it from above. She could see herself, or the part of herself that had been left behind, wandering the streets invisible to the villagers but very much present. The dream fragment looked up suddenly, sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the centuries. When the trapped piece of her soul opened its mouth to speak, Eliza woke with a gasp, but the words echoed in her mind. "Let me rest." She sat up in bed and suddenly understood. The fragment wasn't trying to come home, it was trying to find peace. It had been trapped for months in a world of fear and death, watching the consequences of their escape, unable to intervene. It didn't want to return, it wanted to be allowed to fade away. The next morning she told them about the dream, about her new understanding. "So what do you need to do?" Nathaniel asked. "I need to let go. I need to stop fighting the connection and just release that part of myself. Let it find the peace it's looking for." That evening she stood before the mirror in her bedroom and spoke directly to her reflection. It looked normal at first, then slowly began to change. The face looking back became sadder, more worn, marked by experiences her conscious mind had never had. "I understand now," she said quietly. "You don't want to come back. You want to rest." Her reflection nodded, tears streaming down its face. "I'm sorry for what we left behind, for the damage we might have caused, for trapping you in that terrible time. But I have to let you go now. I have to let both of us heal." For a moment she felt a profound connection to that lost part of herself. All the fear and guilt and sorrow that had been building since their escape. Then, like a candle being gently blown out, the connection faded. Her reflection returned to normal, moving in perfect synchronization with her body. The oppressive sense of being watched lifted. The temperature returned to normal, and the electronics stopped malfunctioning. She felt different, lighter in some ways, but also smaller, as if a piece of her personal history had been erased. There were memories that seemed hazier now, emotions that felt distant. But she also felt at peace for the first time since their escape from Salem. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and Nathaniel continued his remarkable adaptation. He had begun taking classes at the local community college, studying history with a passion that impressed his professors. None suspected their most dedicated student had actually lived through some of the events they discussed. He still had difficult days, times when the weight of his displacement seemed overwhelming. But he was building a new life with determination, finding ways to honour his past while embracing his future. As for Eliza, she found herself changed by the experience in ways both obvious and subtle. She was more cautious now, more aware of consequences. But she was also more appreciative of the present moment, more conscious of how precious and fragile life actually was. The mirror fragments remained in their box in the attic, inert and harmless now. Grandmother Thorne had suggested they bury them, but somehow Eliza wasn't ready. The mirror had brought her pain and terror, but it had also brought her Nathaniel, and shown her truths about herself and her family she might never have discovered otherwise. One evening in the early spring, as she and Nathaniel sat on the front porch watching the sunset, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Touching the mirror that first day?" She considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain it caused. I regret the people who might have died because of what we left behind. But I don't regret meeting you or learning about my family's history or discovering that I'm stronger than I thought I was." He nodded slowly. "I sometimes wonder what would have become of me if you hadn't appeared in that barn, whether I would have lived out my life in Salem Village, married some suitable Puritan girl, raised children to fear the devil and suspect their neighbours. I think I prefer this future, uncertain as it is." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eliza found herself thinking about the nature of time and choice, about how a single decision could ripple across centuries. The mirror was gone, but its influence would continue to shape their lives. Somewhere in the past, in a Salem village that existed now only in history, the echoes of their escape still reverberated. The witch trials had ended, the accused had been pardoned, and the community had slowly healed. But the memory of two strangers who had appeared from nowhere and vanished into legend lived on. And here, in the present, two people who never should have met continued building new lives from the fragments of the old. It wasn't the ending Eliza had imagined when she first touched the mirror, but it was an ending she could live with. The Salem mirror was gone, but its legacy lived on in the choices they made each day, in the kindness they showed each other, and in their shared understanding that sometimes the most profound journeys bring us not to where we intended to go, but to where we needed to be. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The salt air whipped through Maya's dark hair as she picked her way across the tide pools, her sneakers squelching against the wet rocks. The Oregon coast stretched endlessly in both directions, painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. This was supposed to be a relaxing family vacation, but Maya had grown restless sitting around the beach house while her parents read novels and her younger brother played video games. She craved adventure, something more than the predictable rhythm of waves and seagulls. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Maya glanced up to see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She should head back soon, but something caught her eye. A glint of something smooth and pale nestled between two barnacle-crusted rocks. Kneeling carefully, she brushed away the wet sand to reveal a stone unlike any she'd seen before. It was perfectly smooth, about the size of her palm, and carved with intricate symbols that seemed to dance in the fading light. The markings looked ancient, like the runic alphabets she'd studied in her mythology class. Maya had always been fascinated by Norse legends, the stories of Odin and Thor, of warriors sailing across stormy seas to unknown lands. Her fingers traced the carved lines, feeling their surprising warmth despite the cool evening air. Another rumble of thunder, closer now. The stone seemed to pulse beneath her touch, and Maya felt a strange vibration running through her palm and up her arm. The sensation was both thrilling and unsettling, like touching a live wire. She should put it down, should run back to the house before the storm hit, but she couldn't seem to let go. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, illuminating the churning sea in stark white light. The stone blazed with sudden heat, and Maya gasped as electricity seemed to course through her entire body. The world tilted, colours bleeding together like watercolours in rain, and then everything went black. Cold. That was Maya's first sensation as consciousness slowly returned. Bitter, bone-deep cold that made her teeth chatter. She was lying on her side on what felt like rough stone, not the soft sand of the Oregon beach. The air tasted different, thick with smoke and something metallic that made her stomach turn. And there were sounds, terrible sounds that didn't belong to any peaceful coastline. Screaming, the clash of metal on metal, the roar of flames. Maya's eyes snapped open and she scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't the beach where she'd fallen. She stood on a rocky shoreline beneath a sky choked with smoke and ash. In the distance, a village burned, orange flames leaping high into the dark air. Silhouettes moved between the burning buildings, figures that ran and fought and fell. She still clutched the stone, which now glowed with a faint pulsing light that seemed to emanate from deep within the carved runes. The strange warmth spread through her fingers, the only comfort in this nightmare landscape. But as she stared at the burning village, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, a new sound made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Heavy boots crunching over stones, approaching fast. Maya spun around and found herself face to face with a group of men emerging from the smoke. They were tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in leather and mail, with weapons gleaming in their hands. Their faces were streaked with soot and blood, their eyes wild with battle fury. But as they saw her standing there with the glowing stone, their expression shifted to something like awe. The leader, a bearded man with intricate tattoos spiralling up his arms, dropped to one knee. The others followed suit, their weapons clattering against the rocks. Maya backed away, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. She had to be dreaming, or hallucinating, or... "Volva," the leader whispered in a language that sounded familiar yet foreign. His accent was thick, the words strangely shaped, but Maya found she could understand him. "The gods have sent us a seeress." Before she could protest, before she could even begin to process what was happening, more figures appeared through the smoke. These newcomers moved with predatory grace, their weapons raised and ready. Maya caught fragments of angry voices, accusations and counterclaims in that same archaic tongue that somehow made sense to her mind. "She appeared from nothing," someone snarled. "A curse upon us all." "The stone burns with Odin's light," another voice countered. "She is blessed, not cursed." The groups faced off over Maya's trembling form, and she realised with growing horror that they were preparing to fight. Over her. The stone pulsed brighter in her grip, and she felt its strange energy coursing through her veins, changing something fundamental about her perception. The language that had been foreign moments before now flowed more naturally in her ears. The faces around her, painted with mud and blood and fierce determination, belonged to people from another age entirely. Vikings. She was looking at actual Vikings, and they thought she was some kind of mystical prophet. A young warrior stepped forward from the first group, his hand extended toward Maya in what might have been protection or possession. He was perhaps a few years older than her, with auburn hair braided back from a face marked by premature scars. His eyes, startlingly blue in his soot-stained face, met hers with an intensity that made her shiver. "I am Bjorn Ironson," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "If you are truly sent by the gods, then you belong with my clan. We have need of a seeress in the trials to come." One of the rival warriors spat in the dirt. "Your clan is weak, boy. The stranger's power should serve stronger hands." His gaze fixed on the glowing stone with naked greed. "That rune stone has been sung of in the old verses. It holds the power of the All-Father himself." Maya's grip tightened involuntarily on the stone, and its light flared brighter. The effect on the gathered warriors was immediate. Some took another step back while others pressed closer, their hunger for the stone's power written plainly on their faces. She was a prize to be won, a mystical object to be possessed and used. The realization sent a spike of panic through her chest. I don't," she stammered, but the words came out in that strange ancient tongue, as if the stone was translating her thoughts. "I don't belong here." Bjorn's expression softened slightly. "The gods send aid when it is most needed, Seeress. My people face a great battle in 3 days' time. If you are here, it is because the Norns have woven your thread into our tapestry." Before Maya could respond, the rival warrior lunged forward, his hand reaching for the stone. The moment his fingers brushed against hers, the runestone blazed like a miniature sun. Lightning crackled across its surface, and a shockwave of energy sent everyone staggering backward. In the sudden silence that followed, Maya heard the distant crash of waves and, impossibly, the sound of her mother calling her name from what felt like another world entirely. The vision lasted only a heartbeat, a glimpse of the Oregon beach house, warm light spilling from its windows, before snapping back to the smoke-filled nightmare of the Viking raid. But that brief connection to her own time gave Maya a terrible hope. The stone was more than just a mystical artifact. It was a bridge between worlds, between times, and if she could understand how it worked, she might find her way home. Bjorn helped her to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle for a warrior. "Come," he said urgently. "Others will have seen that light. We must reach my longship before more enemies arrive." Maya found herself stumbling across the rocky shore, half carried by Bjorn and his companions as they made their way toward a cluster of dragon-prowed ships pulled up on the beach. Behind them, the burning village continued to collapse into ash and ember. She wanted to ask about the people who had lived there, about the families torn apart by this raid, but the words stuck in her throat. These men had participated in the destruction, had taken pride in their violence, yet they were also the only thing standing between her and the cruel warriors who wanted to tear the stone from her hands. The longship was a work of art and terror combined, its carved dragon head seeming to snarl at the stormy sky. Maya was bundled into the vessel, along with bags of plundered goods and several other captives, women and children who watched her with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. As the ship was pushed into the surf and the warriors took up their oars, Maya clutched the stone and tried to make sense of her impossible situation. She was trapped in what appeared to be the 9th century, surrounded by Viking raiders who believed she was a mystical seeress. The stone that had brought her here seemed to be her only hope of returning home, but she had no idea how to control its power. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a growing certainty that the longer she remained in this time, the harder it would become to find her way back. As the longship cut through the dark waves, Bjorn settled beside her on the rowing bench. Up close, she could see that he was younger than his scars suggested, probably no more than 19 or 20. His eyes held an intelligence that set him apart from the other warriors, along with something that might have been kindness. "You're afraid," he observed quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the oars cutting through water. Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice shaking. "That is wisdom," Bjorn continued. "The gods' gifts are never given without purpose, but that purpose is often hidden. The runestone you carry, it is spoken of in the oldest songs, a key that opens doors between the 9 realms. Many have sought it, but none have been deemed worthy to wield it." "I didn't seek anything," Maya whispered. "I just found it on the beach." Bjorn's eyes studied her face in the flickering light of the ship's torches. "Perhaps, or perhaps you were led to find it. The Norns weave strange patterns, Seeress. What you call chance, we call fate." Over the following days, as the longship made its way along the coastline toward Bjorn's home settlement, Maya began to piece together fragments of her situation. Through halting conversations with Bjorn and careful observation of the world around her, she learned that she had somehow been transported to 9th century Scandinavia, to a time when Viking raids were at their height and the old gods still held sway over human affairs. The stone continued to pulse with its mysterious energy, and Maya discovered that its power seemed tied to her emotional state. When she was calm, it glowed softly, providing warmth and light. But when she was frightened or angry, it flared with an intensity that made everyone around her nervous. She also noticed that during storms, when lightning split the sky and thunder shook the earth, the stone's power peaked, and she sometimes caught glimpses of her own world flickering at the edges of her vision. Bjorn's clan occupied a settlement built on a series of rocky islands connected by narrow causeways. The buildings were low and sturdy, constructed to withstand the harsh northern climate, with smoke rising from central hearths and the sound of metalwork ringing from forges. Maya was given a place in the Great Hall, treated with the wary respect due a person touched by divine power. The women of the settlement brought her food and clothing more suited to the climate, while the men kept their distance, unsure whether she represented blessing or curse. But Maya's presence had not gone unnoticed by the settlement's enemies. Word of the mystical seeress with the glowing runestone spread quickly along the coast, carried by traders and raiders alike. Within a week of her arrival, scouts reported ships gathering in the waters beyond the settlement. Other clans wanted what she possessed, and they were willing to fight for it. "The stone's power grows stronger," Bjorn told her one evening, as they stood on the settlement's highest point, watching the sunset paint the sea in shades of gold and blood. "Can you feel it calling to something?" Maya nodded, though she wasn't sure how to put her experiences into words. The stone seemed to resonate with some deep rhythm of the world around her, pulsing in time with her heartbeat and the crash of waves against the shore. But more than that, she was beginning to understand the runes carved into its surface. They weren't just decorative, they were instructions, a kind of mystical programming that governed the stone's power. "It shows me things," she said carefully, "glimpses of other places, other times. I think it's connected to the stories your people tell about Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, memory and thought, seeing across all the worlds." Bjorn's expression grew troubled. "Then the old prophecy may be true. It speaks of a stranger bearing the All-Father's stone, who will stand at the centre of a great choosing. Victory or defeat, prosperity or ruin, all hanging on decisions made by one who belongs to neither side. What prophecy? Maya asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. 3 nights hence, when the moon is dark, Hakon the Red will come with his fleet, Bjorn replied grimly. He has sworn to take our settlement and claim all who live here as thralls, but the skalds sing that when the rune-bearer arrives, the battle's outcome will rest not with the strongest sword arm, but with the choices made by one who sees across the realms. Maya felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. These people were looking to her for salvation, but she was just a teenager from Oregon who had stumbled into their world by accident. She had no special wisdom, no mystical insight beyond what the stone occasionally showed her, and all she really wanted was to find her way home. That night, as a fierce storm lashed the settlement, Maya lay awake clutching the stone and focusing all her will on the glimpses it showed her of her own world. She saw her parents searching the beach, calling her name. She saw search and rescue teams combing the coastline with flashlights. She saw her younger brother crying, begging them to find his sister. The pain of their worry cut through her like a blade, and she pressed the stone against her chest, willing it to take her back to them. For a moment the vision solidified. She could smell the familiar scent of the beach house, could hear the sound of modern helicopters searching overhead. She reached out toward the image, and her fingers seemed to pass through some invisible barrier, touching something real. But just as she began to step forward, the vision shattered like glass, and she was back in the Viking Great Hall with tears streaming down her face. "The stone fights you," a voice said from the shadows. Maya looked up to see an elderly woman approaching, her back bent with age but her eyes sharp and knowing. She wore the distinctive apron dress and tortoise brooches of a Viking woman of high status, and the other settlement members treated her with obvious respect. "I am Sigrid the Wise," the woman continued, settling beside Maya on the sleeping bench. "I was seeress to this clan before my sight dimmed. The stone you carry, it serves a purpose greater than your desire to return home." "I don't understand," Maya whispered. "Why was I brought here? What am I supposed to do?" Sigrid's gnarled fingers reached out to touch the stone, and it pulsed with gentle light. "The runes speak of balance," she said softly, "of choices that echo across all the worlds. Hakon the Red carries darkness with him, not just death, but an end to the old ways, the old wisdom. If he succeeds here, if his cruelty spreads unchecked, it will poison the very roots of time itself." Maya stared at the old woman, trying to process what she was saying. "You're telling me that the entire future depends on what happens in this one battle?" "Not the future," Sigrid corrected. "The pattern. The great weaving that connects all things. Some knots, if pulled wrongly, can unravel entire tapestries." The storm raged for 3 days, and with it came Hakon's fleet. Maya watched from the settlement's walls as dozens of dragon ships emerged from the mist, their red sails billowing in the wind. The vessels were larger than Bjorn's ship, built for war rather than trade, and they carried hundreds of warriors eager for battle and plunder. Hakon himself stood in the prow of the lead ship, a giant of a man with flame-red hair and a beard to match. Even at a distance, Maya could see the cruel set of his features, the way his men shrank from his casual violence. This was not a leader who inspired loyalty through honour or wisdom, but through fear and the promise of shared brutality. As the enemy ships pulled up on the beaches, Bjorn found Maya on the wall. His face was grim, marked by the knowledge that his people were vastly outnumbered. "The stone," he said urgently. "Its power. Can you use it against them?" Maya looked down at the runestone in her hands. It pulsed with energy, responding to the approaching conflict, but she still didn't understand how to direct its power. "I don't know how," she admitted. "Sometimes it shows me visions, sometimes it flares with light, but I can't control it." Bjorn nodded, though she could see disappointment in his eyes. "Then we fight with steel and courage, as our fathers did before us." The battle began at dawn. Hakon's warriors came in waves, their shields locked together as they advanced up the rocky slopes toward the settlement. Bjorn's people met them at the outer walls, and the morning air filled with the crash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. Maya crouched behind the battlements, clutching the stone and trying to stay out of the way of the defenders rushing past her. But as the fighting intensified, something strange began to happen. The stone's glow grew brighter, and with it came a growing awareness of the battle's ebb and flow. Maya found she could sense the movements of individual warriors, could almost see the threads of fate weaving themselves around acts of heroism and cowardice, life and death. The stone was showing her the pattern that Sigrid had spoken of, the great tapestry of cause and effect that stretched across all the worlds, and in that tapestry she could see the dark stain that would spread if Hakon won this battle. His cruelty would inspire others, would poison the Viking culture with an emphasis on brutality over honour. The raids that had been tests of courage and skill would become exercises in sadism. The stories that should have celebrated heroism and wisdom would instead glorify meaningless violence. A shout brought Maia back to the immediate crisis. A section of the settlement's wall had been breached, and Hakon's warriors were pouring through the gap. Bjorn was there, his sword flashing as he tried to hold them back, but there were too many of them. Maia saw him stumble, blood streaming from a wound in his side, and knew that the battle was nearly lost. Without thinking, she stood up from her hiding place and raised the stone above her head. Light blazed from the carved runes, so bright that it cast stark shadows even in the daylight. The advancing warriors stopped, shielding their eyes, and in that moment of confusion, Bjorn's men rallied and pushed them back. But the effort cost Maia dearly. The stone's power flowed through her like molten metal, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Through the haze of pain, she saw Hakon himself striding through the breach in the wall, his massive sword cutting down anyone who stood in his path. His eyes fixed on her with predatory hunger. "The Cirrus," he rumbled, his voice carrying clearly over the din of battle. "Bring me the stone-bearer, and this can all end." Maia tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. The stone had dimmed to a barely perceptible glow, its power seemingly exhausted. She watched helplessly as Hakon's warriors formed a circle around her, their weapons raised. This was how it would end. Captured and slaved, the stone's power turned to dark purposes. But Bjorn was not finished fighting. With a war cry that seemed to shake the very earth, he threw himself at Hakon's warriors, his sword moving in deadly arcs. Behind him came the surviving defenders of the settlement, inspired by their young leader's courage. The battle raged around Maia as she knelt in the mud, still clutching the stone and praying for its power to return. Thunder crashed overhead, and Maia felt the stone pulse weakly in response. The storm was building again, and with it might come another chance to use the stone's power, or to escape this nightmare entirely. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, trying to connect with the energy that flowed between the worlds. The visions came faster now, sharper and more detailed. She saw herself as a child, reading books about mythology and dreaming of adventures in distant lands. She saw her family, still searching for her on a beach thousands of years in the future. And she saw the branching paths of possibility that stretched out from this moment, some leading to darkness and cruelty, others to hope and renewal. When she opened her eyes, Hakon stood over her, his sword pointed at her throat. Around them the battle had grown quiet, not because it was over, but because everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Bjorn lay nearby, blood pooling beneath him, but his eyes were still alert, still watching. "Give me the stone," Hakon demanded. "Give it to me, and I will let your friends die quickly." Maia looked up at him, this man who represented everything brutal and small about the human spirit, and felt something harden inside her chest. The stone pulsed once, then blazed to life with a light that made the sun look dim by comparison. But this time, Maia didn't try to direct its power outward. Instead, she turned it inward, using it to see the true nature of the choice before her. She could surrender the stone, and Hakon would gain power beyond imagining. He would use it to spread his cruelty across the known world, poisoning the well of human civilization for generations to come, or she could fight him, knowing that victory might cost her any chance of returning home. But there was a third option, one that the stone's visions had been trying to show her all along. The rune-carved artifact wasn't just a bridge between worlds, it was a fulcrum, a point where small actions could have enormous consequences, and Maia was the only one who could choose how to tip the balance. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, and Maia felt the stone's power peak. In that moment of perfect clarity, she made her choice. Instead of trying to use the stone against Hakon, she turned its power on itself. The runes flared brilliant white, then began to crack and crumble. The stone was destroying itself, taking its immense power out of the world, rather than letting it be corrupted. Hakon roared in rage and swung his sword, but the blade passed harmlessly through Maia's suddenly translucent form. She was already fading, caught between worlds, As the stone's final energies carried her home, the last thing she saw was Bjorn's face, his expression mixing gratitude with profound sadness. "You were never meant for our world," he whispered, and his words followed her into the light. Maya woke on the Oregon beach, soaked with rain and shivering with cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind calm waves and a sky painted with the soft colours of dawn. In her hand she still clutched the stone, but it was different now, cracked and dull, its runes barely visible as faint scratches in the weathered surface. She sat up slowly, her body aching as if she'd been running for miles. Around her, the familiar sights and sounds of her own time felt almost alien after her days in the Viking settlement. The distant hum of highway traffic, the geometric lines of modern buildings visible on the bluff above the beach, the plastic debris washed up by the tide, all of it seemed strange and artificial compared to the raw vitality of the 9th century. Maya's parents found her there an hour later, drawn by the emergency beacon on her phone that had somehow started working again. They rushed her to the hospital, where doctors found her dehydrated and exhausted but otherwise unharmed. The official story was that she had been caught in the storm and suffered from exposure, possibly hallucinating from hypothermia. Maya didn't try to convince anyone otherwise, but as she sat in the hospital bed, she noticed something that made her heart race. Around her wrist was a band of braided leather and silver wire, worked in patterns that belonged to no modern jewellery design. It was a Viking arm ring, the kind given to warriors and honoured guests, and she knew, with absolute certainty, where she'd gotten it. In the weeks that followed, Maya researched everything she could find about 9th century Scandinavian history. She learned about the various Viking clans and their raids, about the gradual conversion to Christianity and the end of the old ways. But she found no specific mention of Bjorn Ironson or Hakon the Red, no record of the battle she'd witnessed. Perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps some stories were meant to live only in the hearts of those who had experienced them. Maya kept the broken stone and the arm ring in a wooden box beside her bed, and sometimes, late at night, she thought she could still feel the faintest pulse of power from the cracked runes. She never found another stone like it, despite years of searching along coastlines around the world, and she never forgot the weight of choice that had rested on her shoulders in that moment when the fate of ages hung in the balance. The knowledge that individual decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances could echo across time itself. Maya went on to study archaeology and medieval history, driven by a desire to understand the past that had briefly claimed her. She became an expert in Viking culture and mythology, writing papers about the role of seeresses and the power of belief in shaping historical events. Her colleagues respected her insights, though they never knew the true source of her understanding. Sometimes during thunderstorms, Maya would hold the broken stone and reach out with her mind, trying to catch glimpses of the world she had left behind. She never saw it clearly again, but occasionally in the space between lightning and thunder, she thought she heard the echo of waves against a rocky shore, and the distant sound of someone calling her name across the centuries. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.